Chapter 636. I won't ever write such words again. It's too tiring. Of course, if I only wanted it to be romantic and smooth, I should be able to write it better. The problem is that I can't write it like that. I mainly want to control the whole process and not say a word that shouldn't be said. It's too difficult, but I tried my best. I think everyone can see that. As for those who really had the same interest in details, you can just look at Jiang Shan and The Secret. Those are the true experts. Not too much, not too little. It was just a drop of tear. Fan Xian looked at this scene and couldn't help but shake his head, but he couldn't say anything. He felt around for a moment and found a silk handkerchief from his clothes. He put it next to the little emperor's face. He gently dipped it in the water. The little emperor was startled and immediately recovered her calm with a shocking speed. Her bare arms easily slid into her plain white clothing. Her black hair fell to her shoulders, and her expression was calm. There was no longer any charm. Paired with her indifferent eyes, she gave off a sense of antiquity that was unique to Shangjing. She gazed at Fan Xian calmly until his hair stood on end. Only then did she slowly say, "Help me comb my hair." After saying this, she turned her body. Her smooth neck, thin back and jet black hair faced Fan Xian's eyes. She took out a Tsang Shan wood comb from somewhere and placed it in Fan Xian's hands. In this world, as long as a woman was married, there would always be a very complicated hair combing ceremony on the morning of the second day. Wealthy families would naturally have a nanny or a high-status servant to take care of it. If it was a poor family, then the mother-in-law would personally comb the daughter-in-law's hair. The Northern Qi Emperor probably had no chance of marrying. As a woman, it had to be said to be a kind of tragedy. In such a deep night, she wanted Fan Xian to comb her hair for her. Fan Xian accepted the comb and slowly began to move his arm, allowing the well-spaced wooden teeth to slide through the jet black hair. The little emperor's black hair gradually smoothed out. Fan Xian's heart and hers also gradually became clear. Fan Xian knew how to embroider and comb hair. He was a good man in the boudoir. In a moment, he had combed the little emperor's hair into a style that was clearly different from that of a virgin. It was also not the style of a mature woman. Borrowing the faint moonlight shining through the window, the little emperor looked at herself in the mirror for a while. She seemed to be very satisfied with Fan Xian's handiwork. During the process of combing their hair, the two of them did not say a word, each deep in thought. It seemed that for a time neither of them knew how to deal with the situation between them. A moment later, Fan Xian broke the silence and asked, "Why me?" This question was not about today, not about state affairs, not about the last sentence the little emperor said in a drunken manner. It was only pointing to that summer several years ago, to that small temple in that summer. In this generation of the Northern Qi royal Zhan family, other than a few princesses, there was only this cross-dressing little emperor. If they wanted to continue the bloodline of the Northern Qi royal family for a long time, the little emperor needed a child of her own. Even if she had to take a great risk, she still wanted to give birth to a child of her own. That was why, on that summer night a few years ago, Haitang Duo had stopped at nothing to enchant Fan Xian in that temple. Fan Xian only wanted to confirm one thing. Why did Zhan Daodu, the little emperor, choose him to become the target of the seed? Perhaps in some people's eyes, becoming a stud horse was humiliating, but Fan Xian did not feel this way. His mother in this life seemed to have done something similar many years ago. Furthermore, to become a stud horse, it meant that the horse's bloodline was excellent and powerful. Was this another form of recognition? The little emperor sat silently in front of him and didn't reply for a long time. Suddenly she said, "Your hair is a mess. I'll comb it for you." Fan Xian did not refuse. He handed over the comb and sat quietly by the bed. The little emperor half knelt on the bed and used her knees to crawl behind Fan Xian with great difficulty. She began to comb his hair. The little emperor's posture was very obedient. Kneeling behind Fan Xian and leaning slightly against him, she truly looked like a little wife. However, her hands were not very nimble. As someone who had been an emperor from birth, she was indeed worthy of the evaluation of not working in all four limbs. She had never done anything, much less something as technical as combing hair. The wooden comb slid through Fan Xian's long black hair with great difficulty. Occasionally, it tangled together, making Fan Xian furrow his brows slightly. He didn't make a sound to remind her. He only remained silent. He combed the little emperor's hair to sort out her slightly chaotic heart after their first love and to comfort her extravagant hopes of marrying someone. The little emperor combed his hair because she wanted to appear more like a normal wife. The little emperor knelt behind him and combed her hair earnestly and incompetently. Her gaze lowered slightly and landed on the edge of the bed beside Fan Xian's hand. There were a few thin needles arranged closely there. They glowed with a different light. Some were poisonous, some were not. When they had been intimate earlier, she had already noticed that Fan Xian had carefully removed these items from his hair. She couldn't see Fan Xian's face and could only look at his back. The little emperor's expression relaxed greatly. It made her feel at ease to be able to not let Fan Xian see her expression. In that instant, a faint affection and infatuation surged into the little emperor's eyes. Although it immediately became calm, it still revealed the true affection she had for this young man in the depths of her heart. This was also what Fan Xian didn't understand. Why had he been chosen? Did the little emperor really like him? Your bloodline is very good. The little emperor lowered her head slightly. Her bangs gently swayed in front of her forehead. Since I am going to have a child, of course, I hope to find a good father for the child. What is so good about my bloodline? Fan Xian felt the comb stop on his head. Slowly he said, the blood of the Qing royal family flows in my body. Are you willing to let such a child become the future ruler of Northern Qi? The little emperor started slightly and began to move the comb again with some difficulty. In a quiet voice she said, at that time Duoduo Lily, and I did not know you were the Qing emperor's illegitimate child. Then what exactly do you see in me? Fan Xian smiled bitterly and slowly lowered his head. Using the bright and cunning moonlight, he looked at the little emperor's smooth leg beside his waist stretching out from under the white clothing. His back was very warm and soft. Felt good. The little emperor sighed. As she combed her hair, she said, this matter can't be hidden from you. If I said I saw the tea on my bloodline, it wouldn't make sense. Of course it wouldn't make sense, Fan Xian replied calmly. At that time, no one knew my mother's surname was Yi. The little emperor was silent for a long time. Suddenly she said, you haven't written Story of the Stone in many years. Yes. Fan Xian was absent-minded. He seemed to think of the 2 years when their relationship was very harmonious. Every time he wrote a chapter in Jingdo, he would use the Overwatch Council's fast horses to send it to Northern Qi's Shangjing and into the little emperor's hands. The first people in this world to recognize that he had written the Story of the Stone was Haitang Duoduo and this little emperor. The call of Grandmaster Chao in the palace at night had given Fan Xian a great fright. At that time he had always thought that this little emperor was just a bit frightening. He had not imagined that the body under the dragon robe was an enchanting woman. I once told you that I liked Bangxian's high poetry, the little emperor said calmly with a slight twitch of her lips. Fan Xian made another sound of acknowledgement. Also, you don't look bad. Your personality can be considered straightforward. You don't look like a typical corrupt scholar. The little emperor lightly said a few words that made Fan Xian sink into silence. He knew that she was using these 3 sentences to express a certain meaning. After a long time he said, you like me? The little emperor thought for a long time and then nodded her head. She didn't care if the back of Fan Xian's head could see this action. Fan Xian suddenly smiled bitterly and said, should I feel honored? I'll allow you to be proud for a moment. The little emperor's face darkened. Looking at her appearance, it seemed she wanted to bite him again. I remember the words you said in the royal palace clearly. First worry about the worries of the world, then rejoice in its happiness. I just don't believe whether the world you speak of is truly the world or just the world of the Qin kingdom. The little emperor was silent for a moment and then spoke quietly. It was as if she wanted to give Fan Xian an explanation as to why she was willing to pay any price to defeat Fan Xian. Fan Xian accepted this explanation because he had thought about it for a long time. It was impossible for him to win the trust of the Northern Qi court. No one would believe that the illegitimate child of the Qing emperor was truly an internationalist, particularly someone as intelligent and powerful as the little emperor. He suddenly turned and looked calmly at her close at hand. The two of them were very close. They could feel each other's heartbeat and the heat of each other's breath. He looked at the youth between her brows and suddenly had a thought. He remembered that she was actually just a little girl. You're an idiot. Fan Xian's words were very direct. Since you were prepared to invest in me many years ago, then you have to continue. I said this in the afternoon. If Ku He knew what you're doing now, he would certainly die of anger again. The little emperor's expression changed. It became solemn and slightly angry. Fan Xian didn't care about any of this. Coldly he said, you are my woman. From now on, give up your unrealistic fantasies. Don't try to control me. Don't try to use the method of killing me to disrupt the arrangements of everything in the world. In the future, all you need to do is cooperate with me. The little emperor's eyes lit up. It was not joy but anger. From birth until now, she had never met anyone who dared to speak to her in such a tone. Furthermore, it was said so naturally. You are an extraordinary woman, but in the end, you are still a woman. For some reason, Fan Xian suddenly thought of the eldest princess who had died in Taiping courtyard. His voice became slightly warmer. You and the Empress Dowager have put on a show for so many years and successfully tricked the eldest princess, me, and even the emperor into thinking that there were problems within the northern Qi court. It made me think that the words by the ancient path in the pavilion had any great meaning. He smiled self-mockingly and said, I have put in too much effort for this, so I will not allow you to destroy all of this. I am not someone to be threatened. The little emperor's expression became cold. She thought that Fan Xian was going to return to the original topic. I would never threaten my own woman. Fan Xian suddenly stretched out his hand and gently played with the bangs on her forehead. Gently he said, however, my woman must listen to me. Earlier, when the little emperor had woken up from her drunken stupor, her first words had pierced straight into Fan Xian's heart. My country is your country. If it was a normal person in Fan Xian's position, they would probably have a terrible headache. However, he was not the same. From a long time ago, he knew that his actions were far from the ideals of the people in this world. He was mentally prepared for this. Since it was his country, it had to be controlled by him. Even the northern Qi emperor had to submit to his will. Conquering the ruler of a country seemed to be something that could never be done. However, conquering a woman, and a woman who liked him at that, no matter how determined her will was or how powerful she was, he could still find a sliver of a chance. A new ruler brought a new court of officials. This was a process of conquering and being conquered. Fan Xian only hoped that since they had this brief relationship, she could become more feminine. However, the development of the situation seemed to have broken away from Fan Xian's control. The little emperor looked at him calmly. There was not a trace of tiredness or dependence after venting. There was only eagerness and dissatisfaction. Fan Xian looked at her eyes nervously. He didn't know what she would do next. You are my man. Why can't you listen to me? The little emperor looked at Fan Xian calmly with a slight smile in her eyes. Without waiting for Fan Xian to speak, she gently bit her lower lip and moved closer to his ear. How about we fight again and listen to whoever wins? The two of them were hugging each other without a gap between them. Suddenly hearing these words, Fan Xian's heart jumped. He thought to himself, who's afraid of a fight between witches? This was the little emperor's first taste of a man and a woman. Additionally, she had a strong personality and was not afraid of pain. She was only curious and happy. Fan Xian, on the other hand, was attracted by her identity, as well as the stubbornness hidden in her bones. They both felt this kind of challenge was very exciting. It was like the meeting of dry wood and raging fire. They both thirsted for each other's bodies. It was truly shameless to use a matter of national importance as an excuse to mess around. A rare charm flashed through the little emperor's eyes. Fan Xian's hand tightened and they fought again. In the sword hut near the seaside, the sky brightened very early. It was still early in the night, but faint morning light spilled into the grass hut. Under the large bed, the two people slowly woke up. They were so tired that they could barely open their eyes. The little emperor was exhausted but happy. She curled up in Fan Xian's arms to catch up on sleep. Last night's madness had perfectly made up for Jean Daodu's many years of spiritual regret. It made her finally realize that being a woman seemed to be a happy thing. However, it had also drained all of the energy in her body. It was clear that Fan Xian, who had obtained the final victory, was even more tired. He opened his eyes and looked at the eaves above his head. An absurd feeling suddenly rose in his heart. Such a thing as conquering had, in the end, fallen to the matter of a brother in bed. Yan Bingyun's mocking words that year had now become reality. If Sir Yan Jr. saw this scene and knew the details, he would probably jump down from the Overwatch Council in shock. Was this the legendary swinging a stick around the world? Fan Xian thought self-mockingly. He lowered his head to look at the woman in his arms with slightly red cheeks. Last night had been crazy. In the end, this female emperor's outer shell of concealment had been shattered by him and she had become a true woman. As for Fan Xian's hard work, it was not worth talking about to others. A strange light suddenly flashed through his eyes. Lifting the covers, he randomly threw on a robe and walked to the door. The little emperor woke up. She was confused and shocked. She didn't know what had happened. The sound of footsteps came to the door. The sword boy's respectful voice rang out. After he left, he carefully opened the door and brought back a large basin of hot water and all kinds of snacks, as well as some tools for washing up. Looking at this scene, the little emperor half sat on the bed. Her expression became serious. After the madness came clarity. She finally understood what she had done last night and what it represented. Most importantly, this place was not the Northern Qi Royal Palace. It was also not the legendary Taiping courtyard that Fan Xian had heavily guarded. Rather, it was a relatively unfamiliar place. The Sword Hut. Given Fan Xian's realm, he did not have to worry about someone eavesdropping. Last night, when the little emperor had indulged herself, she had not considered this problem. However, the arrival of the sword boy and the large basin of hot water made the little emperor remember clearly that the person living in the sword hut was no one else but a great grandmaster. Although the sword hut was large and the courtyard was deep, there were still sounds during the madness last night. Although Sigurd was heavily injured and on the verge of death, since he was able to easily force back Lang Tiao and Yun Jilan, presumably his cultivation was still there. It should not be difficult for him to hear clearly what had happened in this room. The Northern Qi Emperor was a woman. It was one thing for Fan Xian to know this secret. After all, he was the little emperor's first and second, and perhaps the only man in her life. If other people knew, the little emperor didn't know what terrifying fate would await her after she lost all standing and reputation. Under such a powerful impact, her face only became solemn and not deathly pale. This was already extraordinary and extremely valiant. Fan Xian did not look at her expression. With a slight smile, he brought the hot water to the side of the bed and began to help her scrub. He knew it was difficult for her to move. After this night, the distance between the two of them had long reached a negative. It was not just physically but also psychologically. During these short intervals, the two guests of the sword hut did not have anything else to do. Other than combing their hair, holding hands and picking at their palms and thighs, they could only talk. They talked about each other's strange lives, their childhoods that were different from everyone else in the world, how men dressed as women, how men looked like women, how they deceived the world to gain fame, how they sat on the throne, how they bathed, how they copied poetry, and so on. The little emperor and Fan Xian were equals. They seriously discussed each other's lives to see what things the other had done inappropriately. From the other's wisdom, they searched for an opportunity to make up for it. The night passed. The two of them had not yet turned white, but they were like old friends. They had not yet turned white, but their hearts were set. Other than the rubbing of the man and woman's bodies, there was also a kind of spiritual connection and comfort, as well as an exceptionally stimulating feeling of challenge rippling through their hearts. The little emperor pulled up the thin blanket to cover her chest and stared at Fan Xian. Lowering her voice, she said angrily, "What if Sigurd finds out? I have said many times to be gentler." Hearing these words, Fan Xian, who had put down the basin of water and was drinking tea to moisten his throat, almost spat it out. He walked to the side of the bed and gently grabbed her chin to stroke it. In an even voice he said, "The old man is about to die. Even if he guesses something, we won't admit it. What is there to be afraid of?" The situation was very strange. The little emperor coldly slapped his hand down and said, "If my identity is exposed, you know how big of a disaster it will be." Fan Xian fell silent. He knew that if the news that the Northern Qi Emperor was a woman got out, the world would probably fall into chaos. The Qin kingdom would not let go of this opportunity and would certainly use it to send out troops. "I've said many times that you have to trust me and cooperate with me. Leave all future matters to me." He placed his hands on the little emperor's bare shoulders and pressed them down slightly. In a sincere and unquestionable tone he spoke. The aces outside the sword hut had already endured an entire night. The torches were gradually extinguished. Lang Tiao and the other Northern Qi aces stared coldly at the door of the sword hut. They didn't know how the emperor was inside and if he had suffered any harm. If he was not worried about Fan Xian or Sigurd going crazy, Lang Tiao would not have waited patiently outside the hut. He would have long let everyone in. Sigurd had already expressed his attitude. The disciples of the sword hut did not charge in, but they were shocked. They didn't know what had happened in the hut during this long night. As time passed, the patience of the people outside grew thinner and thinner. Yun Jilan silently watched Lang Tiao's gaze. He knew that if the sword hut still didn't give an explanation, they would immediately attack the hut again. In a few days, the Northern Qi army would probably also enter Dongyi. Since my teacher has made his stance clear, he will not let the emperor suffer any harm. Even if he is with Fan Xian, my teacher will not allow the Qing people to show any disrespect to the emperor in his eyes." Yun Jilan said in a heavy voice. Lang Tiao's mood relaxed slightly. Given Sigurd grandmaster position and the situation in Dongyi, he would not just watch as his emperor was humiliated. After all, it was Sigurd who had invited them to open the hut. Lang Tiao was no longer worried about the emperor's safety. He had not thought that in one night, the emperor had already been bullied into a woman. Sigurd, that strange old creature, would not just watch as Fan Xian killed the Northern Qi Emperor. If the Northern Qi Emperor and Fan Xian were willing to fight and create chaos, this great grandmaster would not be able to do anything. Chapter 637. I'm truly amazing. Yesterday, it was 6,666 words again. A strange smile flashed and disappeared. Shock floated in this great grandmaster's eyes. Logically speaking, a grandmaster should have experienced countless earth-shattering events in his life. Even if Dong Mountain had collapsed in front of him, it probably would not have made his eyelids blink. However, this shock was clear. Fan Xian had been looking into Sigurd eyes the entire time, so he was able to accurately grasp the thoughts in this figure's heart. Other than smiling bitterly to himself, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The reason he had been looking into Sigurd eyes the entire time was because there was nowhere else on Sigurd body to look at. This short old man was sitting in a wheelchair. The bones on the left side of his face were broken and deeply sunken in. His left arm was broken as well. His sleeves were empty and fluttered in the wind. Although the large hemp clothes covered his body and the extent of his injuries was unknown, it was still a particularly frightening sight to think about. This was the first time in Fan Xian's life that he had seen Sigurd, the most valiant person in the world, the sword saint who had protected Dongyi for decades. In his imagination, this grandmaster-level figure, even if he was not as ethereal as an immortal, would at least have a sense of transcendence. However, he had not expected that the Sigurd who appeared in front of him would be like this. It was wretched and pitiful. Only his eyes were filled with a natural ruthlessness and an unyielding sword intent. Fan Xian could only stare into his eyes, terrified that he would be disrespectful. The atmosphere in the room was very strange. Facing a legendary figure, Fan Xian should have appeared more excited. However, he could not become excited no matter what. Perhaps it was because he knew the other person was going to die in a few days, perhaps it was because he had lived with Uncle Wu Zhu since he was young, or perhaps it was because his parents were both incredible people no less than great grandmasters. The sword boy pushed the wheelchair into the morning light. The faint light clearly illuminated the terrifying wound on Sigurd face. The sword boy obediently retreated. It was Sigurd who broke the silence first. After staring at Fan Xian for a moment, he sighed in a raspy voice, "Admirable, admirable." This great grandmaster had the reputation of being an idiot since he was a child. After he had mastered his swordsmanship, he moved unhindered between heaven and earth. He never had any thoughts of bending his waist. He pierced through the sky and pierced through the earth. He was very arrogant. Even on Dong Mountain, when he had been grievously injured by the Qing Emperor and Yi Liuyun's combined attack, he was still stubborn and laughed to his heart's content. He refused to lower his head. He was the most powerful person in the world. It was basically impossible for him to feel admiration for someone. Thus, when he repeatedly expressed his admiration for Fan Xian's face couldn't help but redden. He was rather embarrassed. Fan Xian knew what this admiration meant. He did not admire the Qing Emperor or Yi Liyun, but he admired him. It was because of the voices that had come out last night. "You're welcome, you're welcome." He coughed to hide his embarrassment and turned around. The morning light shone down, enveloping both the old man and the young man. Fan Xian naturally and habitually stood by the side of the wheelchair. He furrowed his brows slightly as he felt this scene. A strange feeling welled up in his heart. The pitiful short and thin injured person on the chair was the legendary tyrannical and murderous Sigurd. The sunlight shone through Sigurd brows and glowed with a white light. It was as if his brows had suddenly turned white. Fan Xian stared in a daze at the other side of the face that was still intact. He suddenly realized that this great grandmaster was not as old as he had imagined. 3 years ago, when Fan Xian had fled Dong Mountain, only Yi Liyun had been on the boat. Regardless of whether it was Ku He or Sigurd, he had not encountered either of them. Of course, if he had encountered them at that time, he probably would not have been able to escape back to Jingdo. Thus, he did not know what had happened on the mountain at the time. He did not see the wretched sight of a sword light shining through the jade peak, killing all the tiger guards and blood covering the mountain path. But this did not affect his faint fear of Sigurd. He knew that this great grandmaster was somewhat crazy. If he could kill 100 tiger guards, he could easily kill him. Fan Xian had never met Sigurd before, but he was no stranger to this great grandmaster. After he entered Jingdo, Dongyi's sword hut had become the Overwatch Council eldest princess, and even the Qing court and emperor's favorite scapegoat. In any case, this great grandmaster did not leave the sword hut. so he could only allow the Qin Kingdom's shameless people to pour dirty water on him. Because of the eldest princess, the Overwatch Council led by Fan Xian and Dong Yi's Sword Hut had carried out a life-and-death battle during those years. Starting from the Battle of Nyolan Street, they both saw each other as enemies and each used their own methods. It was only when Fan Xian went to Jiangnan and used the power of the shadow that he managed to chase Yun Jilan and his people back. Fan Xian knew that this was because Sigu Jian had always disdained to deal with him. If he had truly wanted to kill him, perhaps he would have died many years ago. After this, Fan Xian successfully inherited the palace treasury. At this moment, Sigu Jian appeared particularly like a mature politician and not an idiot with great martial power. Sigu Jian put down his past grievances and sent his favorite last disciple, 13th Wang, to express his attitude to Fan Xian. Thus, Fan Xian was very familiar with Sigu Jian. Or rather, he thought he was familiar with Sigu Jian. Meeting him now, he realized that Sigu Jian was still a stranger to him, an unfathomable and terrifying stranger with an unknown temperament. There seemed to be an invisible pressure in the Sword Hut emanating from the injured person in the wheelchair, making it difficult for Fan Xian to breathe. "I didn't kill you back then not because I looked down on you," Sigu Jian suddenly said mockingly in a hoarse voice. "The reason I didn't kill you is simple. It's just that you don't know it." Once Sigu Jian opened his mouth, the pressure filling the courtyard weakened slightly. Fan Xian relaxed and quickly said, "Please advise me. Your mother's surname is Yi. Isn't this reason clear?" Sigu Jian furrowed his brows. It seemed that he had not expected Fan Xian to be so stupid. He cursed angrily. Fan Xian shrugged. He truly couldn't understand this reason. He had not gone deep into the Sword Hut to catch up with Sigu Jian. Rather, he wanted to talk about the future of Dong Yi and the world. The number of people who had the right to discuss the world had gradually decreased. Kuhi was already dead. Yi Luyun had truly escaped. After the Dong Mountain incident, many people had died. In the Sword Hut there was the Northern Qi Emperor, Fan Xian and Sigu Jian. They were all people who had the right to sit and discuss the world. "I trust that you have already read the proposal I had 13th Wang bring back." Proposal was a new term. In the 4th year of the Qin calendar, Fan Xian had once had Fan Xizhi write a proposal to open the Danbo bookstore. This year he had also written one and given it to Sigu Jian. He wanted to convince this strange and ruthless great-grandmaster to accept his proposal. "I didn't read it," Sigu Jian said indifferently. With these words, Fan Xian's heart was like a heavy blow. He didn't know what Sigu Jian was thinking. He had thought he would be able to move Sigu Jian a little with the proposal he had painstakingly drafted. If Sigu Jian didn't even look at it, what was there to talk about? "The Qin Kingdom's diplomatic group hasn't arrived yet. What are you in such a rush for?" Sigu Jian looked at him mockingly. Fan Xian fell silent. Suddenly he said, "In my letter last year, I reported to you that I had confidence in controlling Northern Qi. If you trust me, I can also preserve Dong Yi's independence to the greatest degree." Sigu Jian looked at him calmly. His twisted and sunken terrifying face contrasted with his calm eyes. It appeared particularly quiet, but there was a glimmer of a craziness that made one shiver. "That kid is actually a woman. I had not expected it. That is why I said I admired you earlier. If you want to convince me that you have the ability to control the entire situation based on this, it seems to be a bit lacking," Sigu Jian said in a raspy voice. Sigu Jian mockingly said in a raspy voice, "Your father is not a normal person. If you can't satisfy him, how will you fool him?" The Qing Emperor's request was to swallow Dong Yi into his territory. Sigu Jian knew that after his death, Dong Yi and the surrounding vassal states would no longer be able to protect themselves. They could only wait for their fate of being swallowed. Since Northern Qi had come out to cause trouble, Dong Yi would have to wait for the right price and hope to be able to preserve themselves as much as possible. These were in themselves two completely different directions. He had to satisfy both the emperor and Sigu Jian. For Fan Xian this was a difficult task. As the saying goes, follow your brother's feelings and lose your sister-in-laws. Even if the girls in the brothel benefited from both sides, it would be difficult for them to reach such a stage. The key was still Sigu Jian. As long as he nodded, everything could be discussed. Fan Xian thought of this. Very naturally, he pushed the wheelchair and began to walk on the yellow dirt paths around the sword grave. He pushed the heavily injured Sigu Jian to bask in the sun. Sigu Jian closed his eyes and enjoyed the sunlight landing on his body. Suddenly he said, "You're very skilled at pushing the wheelchair. You're better than those children. Why don't you stay and take care of me these few months?" Fan Xian smiled and replied, "It's fine to take care of you for a few months. However, you have to look at those things. The tens of thousands of people in Dongi are all looking at you and waiting for you. You have to have some ideas. As for pushing the wheelchair, I'm used to pushing it in Jingdo. Oh, I remember. That old dog's leg was broken a long time ago. Sigujien suddenly sighed. During these 20 years, the biggest mistake I made was actually getting the wrong target. I had always seen your emperor as my biggest target. I had never thought that if I had killed Qin Pingping at the beginning, perhaps your emperor would not be so arrogant. There was a powerful confidence hidden in the calm words. It was as if Sigujien could kill such a terrifying figure as the director of the Overwatch Council if he wanted to. For some reason, the sea breeze around the sword grave paused slightly. Following the sword intent in Sigujien's words, Fan Xian's heart felt as if it had been stabbed ruthlessly. His face became deathly pale. Only now did he feel the true realm of a great grandmaster. With a thought, the surrounding environment also reacted. Killing intent rose and was difficult to bear. His hands pressed forcefully against the back of the wheelchair, forcefully supporting himself. With great difficulty he said, "Given your cultivation, if you focused on killing Director Qin, he would not be able to live for long. The problem is, if you killed him, Yi Luyun would come to kill the people of Dongi." He breathed with difficulty for a moment and then slowly said, "Even if everyone in your family dies, you still have your disciple. Dongi still has the manner of the master of the city." Sir Sword Saint, just as the Emperor said, strange creatures like great grandmasters should not exist in this world. Since you have appeared, then you cannot act recklessly. You are just a dead object to maintain the balance. That makes sense, Sigujien said with his head lowered. Fan Xian continued to smile with difficulty. Sometimes I feel fortunate on behalf of the people under heaven. Regardless of whether it is Master Ku He or you, there will always be things on your mind such as Northern Qi and Dongi. If you were truly an idiot who did things according to your own preferences but also had the power of a great grandmaster, I'm afraid the entire world would fall into chaos. Of course, he said with emphasis. If that was the case, I would not vainly hope to convince you of anything. Sigujien was silent for a long time. He then suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Last night you gave me many surprises. So, your so-called trump card is on that little emperor. I admit that you have the right to negotiate with me. I also admit that I do care about Dongi's future. Perhaps this is a habit that I will take with me even if I die. I am used to protecting the people of this city." He turned his head and said in a raspy voice, "As long as you satisfy me, I will also satisfy you. Surrender in name, garrison, unchanged for 50 years. Fan Xian's heart beat faster. Looking into his eyes, he threw out a few words with unusual speed. When he was in Qingzhou, he had already said these words to 13th Wang. Now he was just repeating them in front of Sigujien. "Garrison." Sigujien laughed. His laughter was particularly sharp and pierced Fan Xian's eyes with a sharp pain. No matter how he used Jinqi to protect his body, he was unable to block it. His face was deathly pale. With a muffled grunt he cursed, "You won't kill me. What is the meaning of torturing me like this?" Hearing these words, Sigujien involuntarily shrugged and said, "I'm just laughing out of habit. What does it have to do with torturing? The Northern Qi Emperor is actually a woman. Tiske. Sigujien seemed to have not heard Fan Xian's suggestion at all. He was still immersed in this reality. It was as if he was happy that he had finally learned a certain secret before he died. Fan Xian finally realized the strangeness of this great grandmaster's personality. In a flash, he remembered that Zhang Daodu was still catching up on sleep in her room. He wondered if this great grandmaster had been eavesdropping all night. His expression became strange. He unconsciously looked under Sigujien's eyes to see if he had deep dark circles or corns. Sigujien also looked over. Looking at the dark circles around Fan Xian's eyes, he furrowed his brows and said, "Even if it's a female emperor who only does it once every few years, you have to take it easy. If you want to die from indulgence, even if I wanted to, I wouldn't be able to." After these words were said, Fan Xian was greatly embarrassed. However, a thought flashed through his mind. He heard the last sentence clearly. His lips trembled slightly. He didn't know how to respond. The morning light gradually brightened and cast the shadow of the wheelchair on the sword grave. It was like it was pierced by countless swords. It looked very pitiful. Fan Xian looked calmly at the shadow and suddenly thought of the familiar figure he had seen behind the second door when he had been chased by Lang Tiao and Yun Jilan. At that time he had even thought that person had come. Looking at the shadow in the sword grave, only then did he know his guess was wrong. At that time, the person who had appeared behind the second door was Sigujien himself. He had not thought that the feeling of him sitting in the wheelchair would be so similar to Qin Pingping's. Seeming to guess what he was thinking, Sigu Jian coldly said, "Under my eyes, no one can touch you." However, Fan Xian did not feel a sliver of safety. He looked calmly at Sigu Jian and quickly analyzed in his heart. Suddenly he said, "No one can, but that doesn't mean no one dares. Yun Jilan dared to put 13th Wang under house arrest, make a private deal with the Qi people, and chase after me in front of you?" Although Sigu Jian had casually chased Yun Jilan and Lang Tiao out of the hut and intimidated everyone, given his understanding of the great Grandmaster realm, Sigu Jian did not need to appear behind the second door. His attack at the time only proved one thing. Sigu Jian's present strength was no longer what it had been at its peak. "Right now, I cannot leave the hut because no one dares to push me." Sigu Jian's gaze became strange. He had once again guessed Fan Xian's thoughts. "Your father and Yi Luyun have injured me too badly. I should have died a long time ago. Luckily I've survived until now. However, I can no longer move. I can only sit in this damn wheelchair. Even if I want to kill people, I can't run anymore. As long as those people who want to be killed by me stay a bit further away from me, there's nothing I can do." A glimmer of sadness suddenly flashed through Fan Xian's heart. Such a great grandmaster had fallen to such a state in the end, sealing himself in the sword hut and unable to leave. "Of course no one dares to try," Sigu Jian said with his eyes closed. "As long as you are by my side, you are still safe." Fan Xian suddenly opened his mouth and said, "How many more days can you live?" Sigu Jian abruptly opened his eyes. It was as if he had been angered by this bold question. His gaze pierced straight into the depths of Fan Xian's heart like a heavenly sword. Fan Xian's eyes felt a piercing pain. He quickly closed them. After a long time, Sigu Jian faintly said, "There's about 100 more days." Fan Xian opened his eyes. He didn't dare to look at this great grandmaster who had difficulty controlling his emotions. Sigu Jian stared in a daze at the deep pit under his feet and the sword swaying in the wind. He tilted his ear to listen to the crisp clanging sounds. No one knew what he was thinking. Perhaps he was thinking of the countless beautiful scenes in this life, the countless times he had attacked with the sword, the countless victories, and the people who had died under his sword. His expression gradually became dim. He had only lost once in his life on Dong Mountain. However, he had lost so thoroughly that he had no choice but to carry on such a humiliating conversation with a junior beside the sword pit. "I once relied on the sword in my hand to control Dongi and the countless vassal states around it," Sigu Jian suddenly said coldly. Sigu Jian suddenly said coldly, "Only in the last moments of my life did I realize that the only things I could control were this grass hut and this pit." Fan Xian lowered his head and bowed deeply. He knew that Sigu Jian had finally made up his mind. "This bow is to thank the Sword Saint for his mercy on behalf of the Qing soldiers and the people of Dongi." "No need to thank me." Sigu Jian suddenly laughed self-mockingly and said, "If the person from the Qing kingdom had not been you, I would not have agreed." Fan Xian smiled and thought, "The northern Qi emperor had come thousands of li, yet you avoided meeting him. This meant that you already had a plan in your heart. Why did you have to say such things?" The present situation was set. If Sigu Jian wanted Dongi to avoid the disaster of war, there was only one path. Sigu Jian looked at the happy young man beside him. His mood was also strange. He had to admit that although this kid's strength was lacking, his luck was not bad. He was able to use one night to solve most of the biggest problem, the pressure on northern Qi. He smiled again in his heart. This young man still didn't know why his attitude was always there. Sigu Jian really wanted to see Fan Xian's angry expression when he solved the problem at the last moment. However, at that time, perhaps he would already be dead. He thought gloomily. He then turned his head and looked at Fan Xian. "You have to believe me. If it wasn't for you, even if your emperor personally came to beg me on his knees, I would still not agree to the Qing kingdom's conditions." Fan Xian did not understand. Chapter 638. The monthly votes are 250 votes away from third place. It is truly an unlucky number. Everyone, please help me move up a little more, a little more. Thank you. What is your mother's surname? My mother's surname is Yi. Before coming to Dongi, Fan Xian had expected that he would certainly run into people, matters, or past related to the old Yi family. He knew that after his mother Yi Qingmei came to this world, her first stop was Dongi. On the night he was 16, Uncle Wu Zhu had told him everything about Yi Qingmei for the first time, everything that this amnesiac remembered. The Yi family's business began in Dongi. The first fortune they seized in the world was also in Dongi. Later, for some reason, Yi Qingmei chose the Qing kingdom, which was not very powerful at the time. Perhaps, it could be said that she chose the unusually powerful emperor. Yi Qingmei left Dongyi. Fan Xian didn't know if she ever returned. He knew that this large city must have been very important to her. However, he had not thought that Sigu Jian would suddenly bring up the past and use such an awkward and crude excuse. Forget it, forget it. Fan Xian glanced at Sigu Jian and smiled bitterly. I know what you want to say. However, she is she and I am me. Can it be split open? Is your mother willing to see Dongyi, which she once fought for, become something no different from any other county in the Qing kingdom? Sigu Jian smiled mockingly. One cannot forget one's roots. You are her son. You are also a Dongyi person. Fan Xian raised his brows and simply sat down in the empty space beside the wheelchair. His 2 legs dangled in the sword grave, swinging around emptily. With a cold smile he said, although I did not personally see what happened on Dong Mountain, I still know some details. I have also heard the words you once said to Uncle Wuzhu. You want me to be the master of Dongyi? Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at Sigu Jian. With slight mockery he said, just because I am half a Dongyi person? Did you think of such a response after hiding in the sword hut for so long? Don't forget, in the end I am a Qing person. My relationship with the emperor has already been decided. Don't expect to use your identity as the city lord to stir up his majesty's suspicions and force me to break off relations with him. He waved his arm and said calmly, impossible. Of course I will not be the master of Dongyi. Sigu Jian coldly said, you are so afraid of death. Of course you are afraid that your emperor will kill you. I have never hoped that you would take over Dongyi. I am only reminding you that you do not need to innately think for the benefit of the Qing people. I am only comforting you. Even if you think for Dongyi, it is not a treasonous thing. I have thought enough on behalf of the people of Dongyi. Fan Xian did not budge an inch. The words I said earlier, do you think that other than me who would give up so many benefits? Who would risk His Majesty's wrath to persuade him to accept these conditions? This is enough. Sigu Jian closed his eyes and slowly said, perhaps, you've never thought about how your mother died? In the depths of the sword hut, countless swords in the large pit began to tremble at the same time. They gave off a mournful cry and trembled endlessly. It was as if they would all break in the next moment. Fan Xian's legs, which were suspended in the sword grave, also stopped moving in this instant. A serious expression gradually appeared between his brows. An indescribable emotion rose in his eyes. There was no one around. Given Sigu Jian's realm, he was not worried that someone would eavesdrop. However, Fan Xian still felt his heart begin to tighten. With each twitch, it was difficult to resist the pain. He took a deep breath. His face was unnaturally white. In a quiet voice he said, or perhaps, do you have any ideas that can convince others? No, Sigu Jian said coldly. Sigu Jian coldly said, I am only guessing. How could someone like your mother die so mysteriously? If a pig-headed empress of the Qing kingdom or that old whore the Empress Dowager could kill your mother, then your mother would not be your mother. Just like that? Ku He also guessed. Qin Pingping also guessed. Why can't I guess? Fan Xian's lips trembled slightly. In a quiet voice he said, it's best not to talk about guessing. It will kill someone. Is that so? Sigu Jian suddenly laughed loudly. His laughter was filled with endless viciousness and mockery. It is rare to see someone as afraid of death as you. Fan Xian knew what he was looking down on. Without changing his expression he said, to be able to easily kill one's entire family, such a person is rare. Sigu Jian's expression changed. A ruthless light appeared in his eyes. It was as if he could attack and kill Fan Xian at any moment. A heart-rending sword intent began to spread through the air again. This time, Fan Xian did not seem to feel anything. He glanced at him disdainfully and said, if you did it, then you did it. Are you afraid of people talking about it? As for me, you don't need to worry about my matters. He furrowed his brows tightly and sighed helplessly. Sometimes I truly don't understand what you important figures, old creatures, are thinking. Why must you push me to the opposite side of the emperor? Do you really think I have the power to oppose him? Most importantly, do you really think that I'm willing to resist him? He looked at Sigu Jian's angry eyes and shook his head. No matter what, he is still my father, so I don't understand what you people think. Father? Sigu Jian shrunk his body into the wheelchair. His entire person was like a sharp sword that had returned to its sheath. There was no longer any light. If I really get angry, I can kill both father and mother. Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. He thought to himself that there was truly no need to discuss such things as human ethics with this idiot. As for the true cause of Yi Qingmei's death, at the most crucial moment of the Jingdo rebellion, before the eldest princess died, she had pointed it out to Fan Xian. Qin Pingping's actions, whether intentional or not, seemed to prove this point. However, Qin Pingping did not say it clearly. Minister Fan also did not say it clearly. After these two old comrades who had personally experienced this matter, suspected each other for many years, they finally set their sights on a certain person. However, they did not want to tell Fan Xian this matter clearly. Other than Sigu Jian, who feared nothing and only wanted to see the Qin kingdom go into trouble, no one tried to lead Fan Xian onto a path of no return just because of speculation. You are about to die. Don't hope to see the Qin kingdom fall into internal chaos before you die. Fan Xian nodded his head slightly. It was as if he wanted to convince Sigu Jian and himself. Accept my sincerity and peacefully wait for your death. I will look after the millions of people in Dongyi well for you. Sigu Jian stared coldly in front of him for a long time. He then said, Believe me, one day, you will walk the path that the wretched heavens have arranged for you. I am going to defy the heavens. Fan Xian said with a loud laugh. He laughed until he began to cough. His face flushed red and he cut a wretched figure. Sigu Jian glanced at him disdainfully. Fan Xian was angered by this gaze. Gritting his teeth, he said in an icy voice, Regardless of whether it is Ku He or you, it seems that before they died, they all placed their hopes on me. Is this not a ridiculous thing in itself? This is not the will of heaven. It is just the selfish thoughts of you major figures. Selfish? Sigu Jian shook his head. I don't know what that old baldy did before he died. Fan Xian shrugged and said, he sent his best disciple to Jingdo to extend Qin Pingping's life. It looks like he is counting on Qin Pingping to become the cause of internal chaos in the Qin kingdom. Ha 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 ha. Sigu Jian couldn't resist roaring with laughter. As he laughed, he cursed, So, that's what that damn baldy thinks. It looks like he is counting on the Qing Emperor and Qin Pingping to make a huge ruckus. You will be stuck in the middle, unable to be a person, and then he will force you to go crazy. Your judgment is not bad. He is the same as me. We both place our hopes on you. However, Sigu Jian twisted his neck and said disdainfully, Ku He is too stupid. It would have been better to directly force you on such a matter. Why go through Qin Pingping? Ku He underestimated that old dog's loyalty to the Qing Emperor. Please, I am right in front of you. Isn't it a bit boring for you to directly force me to rebel? As Fan Xian sighed, he pointed at the large pit in front of him and the sword that appeared particularly old after being weathered by the wind and rain. I clearly know that there is a pit in front of me. Am I still going to jump in? Sigu Jian did not directly answer this question. He shrunk his body and said, Actually, regardless of whether or not you admit that you are a Dongyi person, I am not too worried about the stupid people in this city. Don't forget, Miss Ning is an Eastern barbarian through and through. That first prince of yours can't be like you and refuse to admit his origins. Fan Xian shrugged. He knew what he said was correct. The emperor only had 3 sons left. 2 of the grown ones had too many ties to Dongyi. If the Qin kingdom truly sent troops to attack, it would indeed be troublesome. The most important problem is that there are many pits in one's life. You clearly know that it is in front of you, but you have no choice but to jump in with your eyes wide open. Sigu Jian pursed his lips and pointed one arm toward the depths of the sword pit. His entire body was mixed with the aura of an old man and an irresistible pressure. Faintly he said, 3 years ago, I told Jilan that even though I knew that there was a pit in front of me, I was still going to jump in. He was talking about the Dong Mountain matter. Regardless of whether it was Ku He or Sigu Jian before they set off to assassinate the emperor, they had both thought about it countless times. They had both suspected that it was a pit. However, time waited for no one. The situation was pressing. The 2 great grandmasters had no choice but to jump. They had fallen wretchedly. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, There's nothing more to say about these things. After the diplomatic group arrives, what needs to be done has to be done. You don't need to worry about my matters. So, shouldn't we talk about happier things right now? Happier? Sigu Jian suddenly cursed angrily. I am about to die. I haven't left this broken hut in 2 years. How can I be happy? Oh, you are truly pitiful. Although your cultivation is there, it is difficult for you to move. You don't dare to casually leave the hut and have been forced to sit for years by your eldest disciple, Fan Xian said mockingly. Fan Xian laughed mockingly and said, Back then King Wei Ling was starved to death by his own son in the Li Palace. If Yun Jilan also did the same thing, you, a great grandmaster, would die too unsightly a death. I'm not useless like King Wei Lingwang. Sigu Jian's eyes were sunken and suffused with a cold light. I just don't want to go out. What does that have to do with Jilan? Sitting in a wheelchair in the sun is indeed a pitiful feeling of being old and about to die. However, you have to get used to it. Fan Xian knew he was speaking the truth. Even if he was a great grandmaster about to die, if he wanted to leave the hut, who dared to stop him? Who could stop him? That makes sense. Sigu Jian suddenly lowered his head to glance at him. The sun is pretty good today. Why don't you push me out for a walk? Fan Xian froze where he stood. He didn't know how many aces were watching him covetously outside the sword hut. Even if Sigu Jian spoke to protect him, walking in Dongi, the difficulty was a bit too great. The Northern Qi Emperor is still in the hut, he said quietly with his head lowered. Isn't that your woman? Let's walk around together. Sigu Jian coughed and called over a child. He went to the room to invite the Northern Qi Emperor out. Before long, the little emperor, who had already put on her clothes, slowly walked over from the other side of the sword grave. From a distance, she saw Sigu Jian sitting in a wheelchair, as well as Fan Xian sitting rudely by the sword grave. The clothes from last night had long been torn. The sword hut had prepared well. The little emperor Zhang Daodu was wearing light green clothing. It did not look seductive at all. It only had the aura of a weak scholar. Coming to their side, the little emperor smiled slightly and said in a low voice, "It is indeed difficult to see the sword saint's face." Sigu Jian tilted his head slightly and rudely did not reply to this question. Instead, he waved his hand and chased the child far away. After a long time, the corners of his lips twitched. Looking at the Northern Qi Emperor, he quietly said, "Greetings, Your Majesty." The sword saint is too polite. The little emperor's gaze didn't even glance at Fan Xian sitting on her. This kind of composure was truly first-rate in the world. However, her calm exterior was easily broken by Sigu Jian. This great grandmaster smiled and gazed at the Northern Qi Emperor with a complicated expression. In a raspy voice he said, "There is nothing good to see an old creature like me. However, a female emperor is the first in 1,000 years. I am very happy to be able to see Your Majesty with my own eyes." After these words were said, the Northern Qi Emperor's expression immediately changed. She stared angrily and coldly at Fan Xian. However, Fan Xian did not have any reaction. Sigu Jian gazed at the little emperor and said with a slight smile, "First, I already know that Your Majesty is a woman. Second, I am about to die and won't go around telling people. I am a strange person who likes to keep candy in my own box and not share it with others." Sigu Jian didn't look at the little emperor, whose expression changed endlessly. He continued in a quiet voice, "Third, because I am about to die, we can speak more directly between us. Earlier I was urging Fan Xian to rebel. I wonder if Your Majesty is interested in this suggestion." The little emperor took a deep breath and forcefully pushed down the slight fear and unease in her heart. Calmly she said, "I am very interested in this suggestion. If Sir Fan Jr.'s rebellion fails, you can come live in Northern Qi." "I also think so. Regardless of whether it is being the master of the city or a male empress, presumably it is both more comfortable than being the Qing Emperor's servant." However, he is not willing to agree. Fan Xian sat by the edge of the pit beside the sword grave and said, "A scholar's rebellion cannot be accomplished in 10 years. Don't you know that I am the most famous scholar in the world?" "Yes." Sigu Jian smiled strangely and looked at the little emperor. "That is why we have decided not to continue this topic. Instead, we are going to the seaside in the city for a walk. I wonder if Your Majesty is interested." "Can I say no?" the little emperor asked angrily. Fan Xian replied from below, "Of course not." Sigu Jian was the god of Dongi. Regardless of whether it was actively or passively, a distance was always maintained between gods. It was clear that this great grandmaster in the wheelchair had not come out to casually look at the street view in many years. His entire being appeared to be rather excited. Fan Xian and the little emperor walked slowly behind the wheelchair. Occasionally they would glance at each other but didn't speak. They were actually very shocked that the three of them had so easily left the sword hut without the sword hut and Northern Qi aces discovering any trace. Even if it was Sigu Jian, it still shocked Fan Xian that he could do this. Walking through the streets and alleys of Dongi, Fan Xian could clearly sense that no one was following them. Given Sigu Jian's realm, if someone followed them for more than a moment, they would probably immediately be hacked into countless balls of blood by the rootless sword intent on the wheelchair. The three of them came to a large tree on the outskirts of the city. The tree crown stretched out widely. The green color blocked out the sky and sun. They rested there, hiding from the blazing sun. Chapter 639. Happy birthday to Master Yuan. I was forced to do this. In the depths of spring, all kinds of trees were stretching their branches and spitting out green leaves. Dongyi was close to the seashore. The moist sea breeze blew day and night, making spring come earlier and fiercer here than in other places. The period of time for spring to accumulate was also longer. No one knew how many years this big green tree on the outskirts of the city had been growing here. The trunk was tall and straight, but it did not have the intention of piercing the sky. Countless green leaves gathered at the crown of the tree to form a large canopy, appearing exceptionally beautiful and benevolent. It blocked the sun in the sky, casting a shadow over the people entering and exiting the city. This tree was very large. The area of its shadow was several mu of land. Many people were resting under the tree. Under the tree were roots that protruded from the soil. They were like the thick body of a dragon, steady and solid. Sigu Jian, Fan Xian, and the little emperor rested temporarily beside these roots. This strange combination did not attract the attention of passers-by. It was probably because there had always been many strange people in Dongyi. Fan Xian sat on the tree root and felt the shade under his butt. He didn't know what kind of tree the tree behind him was and couldn't be bothered to investigate. He only lowered his head to look for ants or dung-killing cockroaches moving balls of dung. He didn't find anything. How old was she at that time? 5 or 6, 7 or 8. Sigu Jian sat in the wheelchair and furrowed his brows. He thought for a long time. It seemed that because of the passage of time, his memory had become blurry. He spat on the ground and said, "In any case, it was just a little girl." "How old were you at that time?" "I should have been in my teens." Sigu Jian scratched his head. "You know, my brain has never been very good. It's always hard for me to remember such complicated questions." "I don't think my age is a complicated question," Fan Xian said. "Geniuses are always different from others in certain areas," Sigu Jian said with a cold smile. He clearly did not care about Fan Xian's mockery. The other side of a genius is an idiot. Fan Xian glanced at him lazily. "Of course, everyone knows you were an idiot when you were young." Sigu Jian didn't say anything. He only met Fan Xian's gaze. He tried to find some shadow of his past in the crevices of the tree roots. The little Emperor Zhan Daodu stood coldly to the side, looking at the old man and the young man's stupidity. She felt disapproval in her heart. The three of them had traveled peacefully. Based on the theories of the secular world, the little emperor's status was the most noble. It was clear that neither Sigu Jian nor Fan Xian cared much about this. Sigu Jian and Fan Xian seemed to be interested in looking for ants. They stayed the entire time under the large tree the entire time. It was as if they of the green were to die. The little emperor furrowed her brows slightly. She thought about how the officials outside the sword hut were probably still worried about her. Additionally, she didn't know what would happen next. She was also worried whether or not the two of them would reveal her fate. Feeling slightly worried, she quietly said, "Lady Yi is no longer here. Even if you watch her for another 3 years, you cannot hope for her to come back to life." These words seemed to be stating a matter, but they were also somewhat heart-wrenching. The little emperor's intelligence and reaction speed were fully displayed at this moment. In the sword hut, Sigu Jian had only briefly mentioned the matter of persuading Fan Xian to rebel. She had caught on to some vague clues and tried to point it out. With these words, Sigu Jian and Fan Xian both raised their heads and glanced at her, making her feel a little flustered. Fan Xian shrugged and said, "I just think ants are more interesting than people." Sigu Jian looked at Fan Xian and sighed in admiration. "When your mother accompanied me to find ants, someone asked us this. She also answered this way." Following Sigu Jian's joyful narration, Fan Xian smiled. The scene from many years ago seemed to rise before his eyes. An idiot with a runny nose squatting under a big tree watching ants moving and fighting. He might even untie the belt around his waist and pee on the ant nest. The passers-by and residents of Dongyi all knew the identity of this idiot. When they passed him, they all had expressions of pity and disgust in their eyes, but no one was willing to go up and talk to him. Then, a blind young servant holding the hand of a little girl came from afar to Dongyi. They came to this big tree and found the idiot who was so focused that he didn't care what was happening around him. The little girl, who was carved from jade, squatted curiously by the idiot's side and asked, "What are you looking at?" The idiot glanced at her impatiently and said, "I'm looking at ants." The little girl made an "oh" sound and began to accompany him in looking at ants. They watched for a long time. Finally, someone at the side couldn't stand it anymore and reminded the young servant that this idiot was the young master of a major family in the city. He was just an idiot. Don't let your young mistress be stupid with him. After the little girl heard these words, she didn't stand up. She smiled and said, I just feel that sometimes ants are more interesting than people. It was clear that the meaning hidden in these words was much more mature than the age this little body showed. However, the passers-by and people under the tree didn't notice this. They just wondered whose family this young mistress belonged to. She was so pretty and clean, like a fairy who had walked out of a painting. She was squatting with the most famous idiot of the master of the city. They couldn't bear to watch any longer. The little girl waved her hand. The blind young servant, who had been as cold as a block of ice, also squatted down beside the two of them. Although he didn't want to squat, there was no difference between squatting and standing. Since she wanted him to squat, then he would squat. At that time there were 3 of us. Sigurjian was continuing his memories. He scratched his slightly itchy face and said in a raspy voice, We watched the ants fight for half a day. Then I invited them to my home as guests. Your home? My stupid father used to be the master of Dongi. Don't you know? Oh, I've heard of it. However, that was many years ago. Your stupid father died to your sword a long time ago. I didn't think of it right away. The manor of the master of the city was very large and luxurious. Sigurjian suddenly opened his mouth and smiled. But the place I lived in was like a dog kennel because I was an idiot. My stupid father hated me the most. Furthermore, my mother was only a serving girl. Do you understand what I'm saying? I've read many similar novels. Fan Xian nodded. No one in Dongi dared to discuss Sigurjian's past, but it didn't mean the Overwatch Council didn't do research in this area. He had a clear understanding of Sigurjian's past. He knew what kind of humiliating and belittling the idiot had lived in the manor of the master of the city. However, it was only now that he learned that Sigurjian's birth mother was a serving girl. That serving girl had probably died many years ago. Your mother and Wu Zhu were the first friends I made in my life, Sigurjian suddenly said seriously. Although the place I lived in was terrible and I couldn't even bring out a cup of tea, they didn't look down on me and still went with me. Perhaps it was because I was an idiot at the time, so I didn't think there was a problem. But it was clear that many people in the manor thought there was a problem. They could not accept 2 people of unknown origins living in the manor, particularly with the idiot young master. After a few days, Yi Zi and Wu Zhu left the manor. I didn't mind. In any case, I had to go out during the day to see ants. On the way, I would go to the room they rented to play. This is truly the first time I learned that you once had such interactions with my mother and Uncle Wu Zhu. Sigurjian furrowed his brows and said in a cold voice, Did Wu Zhu never mention to you what happened in Dongi? No. Fan Xian sat on a tree root and picked up a thin branch. Unconsciously picking at the dirt, he replied, Later on, my memory became much worse. Oh, Wu Zhu, this kid, his memory actually deteriorated? Sigurjian suddenly laughed loudly. Isn't that similar to my idiotic appearance back then? Fan Xian glared at him. Shortly after, he smiled bitterly and shook his head. Do you know where my mother and Uncle Wu Zhu came from? This was something that had troubled him for a dozen years. Although he could vaguely guess a little and Xiaoan had mentioned it a little before his death in the precipice of Shi Mountain outside Shangjing, Xiaoan's narration before his death only explained his mother's origins and did not mention Uncle Wu Zhu. In Xiaoan's narration, he and Ku He had suffered thousands of li and entered the outskirts of the temple. Then they had seen Yi Qingmei. The 2 of them had rescued Yi Qingmei from the temple but had been separated halfway. At that time Yi Qingmei was only 4 years old. It had been 2 years or even longer since Sigurjian had seen her in Dongi. During this time, what had Yi Qingmei been doing? How had Uncle Wu Zhu come to her side? In Xiaoan's memories, he had once mentioned that Yi Qingmei seemed to be deeply worried about someone in the temple. She could not let it go, so she left decisively. Was that person Uncle Wu Zhu? Hearing Fan Xian's question, Sigurjian suddenly became very quiet. A moment later, he faintly said, At that time, it was impossible for me to know where they came from or where they were going. Later I slowly found out. He turned his head slightly and stared at Fan Xian with his unfathomably calm eyes. Do you still not know where Wu Zhu came from? Fan Xian lowered his head and was silent for a long time. Uncle Wu Zhu was a strange creature. Uncle Wu Zhu would not age. Uncle Wu Zhu did not know internal strength. Uncle Wu Zhu was very good and powerful. So, Uncle Wu Zhu. He laughed bitterly and said, Even if Uncle Wu Zhu came from the temple, what about my mother? Nonsense. The blind man is an emissary of the temple. Your mother is his mistress. Of course she is a fairy of the temple. Otherwise, how could she have done so much on her own? Sigu Jian scolded irritably. It was as if he felt that Fan Xian's question was unnecessary. However, Fan Xian did not feel that it was unnecessary. He smiled bitterly and thought that his mother, Yi Qingmei, was clearly like him. She had a soul that did not belong to this world. What relationship could she have with the temple? Fan Xian and Sigu Jian spoke energetically and sighed as they reminisced. Their voices naturally converged and did not affect anyone under the tree. The Northern Qi Emperor stood by the two of them the entire time, quietly listening to all of this. Her face gradually paled as the hands in her sleeves began to tremble. She didn't expect that she would be able to hear such a soul-stirring secret under this tree. She finally understood why a young man like Fan Xian, from the beginning of his time in the world, possessed a confidence and even arrogance that no one else in the world could match. He dared to be so disdainful of an emperor, sit on equal footing with a great grandmaster like Sigu Jian, shamelessly talk about the world, and try to control everything in his hands. The little emperor knew that Fan Xian's mother was Yi Qingmei. She also faintly knew that there was a blind great master behind him. It was not until now that she learned that the young lady of the Yi family and the blind great master had an inexplicable connection to the temple. What was the temple? It was a god that floated above the clouds in the sky, coldly watching the suffering of the mortal world without the slightest change in expression. It was a will that surpassed mortals. It was the legendary protector of the land. However, no one knew where the temple was or what it was, other than Master Ku He, who had seen it with his own eyes. Ku He kowtowed in front of the temple for 3 days and gained the abilities of a great grandmaster. Under the large tree, the young lady of the Yi family met Sigu Jian. Sigu Jian went from being an idiot with a runny nose to a warrior with unparalleled sword skills. Another example was the Qing Emperor. The little emperor's short eyelashes trembled uncontrollably. From the beginning of the Wei Kingdom until now, everyone in the world wanted to see the appearance of the temple with their own eyes. They wanted to find the shadow of the heavenly path in the illusory. Back then, the Wei Emperor had sent out thousands of troops to the north to search for the temple in order to live forever. Behind Fan Xian there was the shadow of the temple. The Northern Qi Emperor glanced at Fan Xian's silhouette. Her heart was shocked and complicated. Fan Xian took a deep breath and said, "I should know a little about what happened later." After mother lived in Dongyi for a few years, she began to do business. That created the Yi family as well as the present Qing Palace treasury. No matter how things develop, it is never so simple. Sigu Jian raised his remaining arm and raised a finger. Even if Yi Qingmei was an immortal, she would not have been able to do what she did without any help. She needed someone to help her. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and looked at Sigu Jian. "You." "Me," Sigu Jian said coldly. Sigu Jian coldly said, "Although I am an idiot, I am, after all, the young master of the manor of the master of the city. As long as I control the manor of the master of the city, the Yi family business will be able to do as they please within Dongyi." "I understand." Fan Xian lowered his head. The chance encounter under the tree was not necessarily a chance encounter. To put it another way, before she entered Dongyi, she already knew the situation in the city. That is why she chose you. "No, a chance encounter is a chance encounter," Sigu Jian said coldly. Sigu Jian coldly said, "At least that is what I firmly believe. If she is looking for collaborators, there are many better than me. The things in her head are enough to attract countless riches. The existence of the blind man can ensure that she has no true enemies in this world." "What were you doing in the years before you started your business?" Fan Xian did not argue with this question. "I continued to look at ants and practice my swordplay. One day Fei Jia, that poisonous old man, came." Sigu Jian yawned. It seemed that the long hours of reminiscing had taken a toll on his mind. "Oh, teacher said that the most glorious thing in his life was turning an idiot in Dongyi into a great grandmaster." Fan Xian smiled. Sigu Jian smiled mockingly and said, "It is just that my mind is easily pedantic. I'm not truly an idiot. What does becoming a great grandmaster have to do with Fei Jia?" Fan Xian's eyes and brows held a smile. "Naturally, it has to do with my mother." Sigu Jian was silent for a moment and then also smiled. "Your mother was able to pass the martial method of Tianyi Dao to Ku He, so she could pass the sword method to me. However, I am a genius. Your mother's sword method was not very useful. What was truly useful was something I comprehended later on." You seem to be more narcissistic than I thought." Fan Xian shrugged. He knew that this great grandmaster was speaking the truth. Even if the Sigu sword method was one of the martial methods Yi Qingmei had stolen from the temple, It was impossible for a mortal to reach the realm of a great grandmaster unless one was a great genius, perseverance, and luck. There are many meanings to a genius. Sigujian's eyelids drooped as if they could close at any moment and never open again. Your mother once said that my genius lies in focus and coldness. It is not easy to find someone who can watch ants move for 10 years, Sigujian said in a raspy voice. Sigujian said in a raspy voice, an idiot who uses thin branches to kill tens of thousands of ants is even harder to find. I was lucky to meet your mother in Wuzhou. Your mother was also lucky to meet me in Dongyi. Fan Xian couldn't speak for a long time. He quietly savored these words. He thought to himself that decades ago, a storm had been brewing on the land. Who knows how many geniuses had appeared? Someone with Ku He's perseverance, Sigujian's obsession, and the emperor's endurance. They had all appeared at that time. Then Yi Qingmei had taken Uncle Wu Zhu and escaped from the temple and met these people. Regardless of realm, luck, talent, and willpower in this world, no one could compare to these warriors who had not yet become great grandmasters. Aitang could not. Aitang could not. Her teacher dared to eat human flesh. Fan Xian could not. His old emperor could endure the unparalleled pain and despair of having his meridians shattered. 13th Wang could not either. His sword saint teacher did not care about human life at all. The young people of this time all had their flaws and inadequacies. This kind of difference would take many years and many setbacks to make up for. Only then would they be able to touch the layer of paper between heaven and man. Finally they would leap over and become a true great grandmaster. Everything is fate. Fan Xian looked at Sigujian and sighed. Sigujian looked at Fan Xian with a strange expression and said, "Do you want to learn? If you want to learn, just say it." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew what this sword saint was preparing to teach him. A bitter smile rose involuntarily to his face. In a quiet voice he said, "I think you already know." "I already know." Sigujian coldly said, "I am talking about the true Sigujian." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He was silent for a long time. Suddenly he said, "In reality there is no difference. The important thing is still the people. The young people of my generation still cannot compare to your generation. Of course this kind of gap may slowly shrink. Even if you moved everything in the temple in front of me, what if I couldn't learn it?" His heart was filled with boundless emotions. It seemed that the martial secrets his mother had stolen from the temple back then had been passed on to these great grandmasters. Apart from Yi Liuyun's flowing cloud release hand, the origin of which was a little unclear, the others had already received sufficient proof. Outside the temple, Ku He had paid the price of being heavily injured to save Yi Qingmei, who had only been 4 at the time. Then he had obtained the price from Yi Qingmei's hands, which was now the supreme technique of Tianyi Dao. Although Sigujian's sword technique was something he had comprehended himself with exceptional spiritual energy and stubbornness, it was clear that without the chance encounter under the large tree, an idiot would still be an idiot. If it could not be activated, how could he advance? As for the little yellow booklet that had always followed Fan Xian, the first volume was the tyrannical way, and the second was the kingly way. It had been with him for 20 years. Now, he understood that this was something his mother had left for the emperor. Then, somehow, through Wu Zhu's hands the emperor had left it for him. It was the tyrannical martial method that made Fan Xian feel a sense of defeat. No matter what, he could not enter the realm of the kingly way. He had also learned Tianyi Dao's Jinqi method, but it did not help him in any way. Even if Sigujian truly had the so-called true Sigujian to pass on to him, what use would it be? The things Yi Qingmei had left behind in this world had already been gradually picked up by Fan Xian. One more seemed to be of no use. Back in the day Yi Qingmei grew into a towering tree in Dongyi. I relied on the sword in my hand to obtain a position in Dongyi and become her partner in catching bugs by the side of this large tree, Sigujian said quietly with his eyes slightly closed. Sigujian closed his eyes slightly. In a quiet voice he said, "If you can't practice it, then continue to practice. It is not so easy for a tree to grow." Chapter 640. Fan Xian stood under the large tree with one hand on his waist and the other gently patting the tree trunk. His mouth said it was forced, but there was a smile in his eyes. His appearance was as shameless as one could imagine. It was as if his entire body had been marked with many small squares. Each square had a large word written on it. This was the so-called cheap square. This young man from the Qing kingdom, in front of Sigujian, not only did his words and actions offend, he even began to be cheap. The northern Qi emperor, who had been silently listening to their conversation and digesting the shock in her heart, tried to seize an opportunity. Seeing this scene, she could no longer resist. Looking at Fan Xian, she sighed and said, "How can a person be so shameless?" Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at her. With a self-mocking smile, he said, "You should know that I have learned Tianyi Dao. You should also know that I know the tyrannical martial method. If I also learn the Sigu sword, although it is not a burden to have more skills, I always feel that I will become a strange creature. Furthermore, perhaps I will wipe out all possibilities in the future. Most importantly, I have never believed that there is love without reason or hate without reason in this world." He turned towards Sigu Jian in the wheelchair and quietly said, "You still haven't given up on the idea in your heart. Must those old fellows cultivate an opponent for my emperor before they die?" Sigu Jian's expression was cold as he said, "Of the three of you, I didn't think highly of you in the past. Unexpectedly, you've changed a lot in these 2 years. You've improved a lot. It is beyond my expectations." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and replied, "After experiencing many life and death matters, one will always feel deeply moved." He knew that the three people Sigu Jian was referring to were him, Haitang, and 13th Wang, the three young people most likely to be close to the realm of a great grandmaster. He thought for a bit and then continued, 13th should have learned it before, but even he could not comprehend its true meaning, much less me. Sigu Jian didn't say anything. On the contrary, it was the Northern Qi Emperor who smiled slightly and said to Fan Xian, "If you really don't want to learn, why don't you give this opportunity to me?" You. Fan Xian laughed out loud. The Emperor is truly someone who does things differently. The little Emperor pressed her thin lips together into a smile and said, "The Sword Saint just wants to make more trouble for the Qing Emperor after he dies. You are, after all, his illegitimate child. I'm afraid you won't be able to harden your heart. Passing it to me seems more direct." Hearing these words, even Sigu Jian couldn't resist laughing hoarsely. Unexpectedly, there are more and more interesting people in the world. All right, let's not talk about other people's business. Fan Xian stood seriously behind Sigu Jian. His hands gently rested on the back of the wheelchair. "Since I want to learn, I have to hurry. Should I go bathe and fast for a few days?" Sigu Jian's expression was strange. Turning his head to glance at him, he said, "Swords are used to kill. Even if you wash for 100 days in the end, you will still be stained with blood. Why wash?" Fan Xian shook his head and said, "Since you want to teach me, you have to act like a teacher. You should have learned most of the sword techniques from him." Sigu Jian narrowed his eyes slightly and coldly said, "A sword is a dead object. What holds it is the hand. No matter which direction you stab or chop down from, no matter how many changes there are, it is impossible to exceed 10,000. In the end, space is only so big." Fan Xian listened silently and seriously. To the side, the little emperor also closed her eyes tightly, unwilling to let go of a single word of Sigu Jian's. Even if her realm was not enough for her to understand too much, forcefully memorizing it, there were still many talented aces in the Northern Qi court, such as Haitang, who was far away on the grasslands. How can a sword stab out and kill someone? This is a problem with sword techniques. There is always a limit to the changes in sword techniques. In tens of thousands of years, who knows how many virtuous people of the past have put in hard work. As the saying goes, there is nothing new under the sun. No matter what kind of change there is, it has long been deduced by others. Thus, the sword technique has never been the most important part. Sigu Jian's remaining arm rested calmly on the armrest of the wheelchair. He slowly stroked it like he was stroking the hilt of an ancient sword. When you sense a certain realm, you should understand that what you need to consider with a murderous sword is not how to kill, but whether you should kill. It seemed to be a very profound statement, but Fan Xian understood it. Wu Zhu had once talked to Fan Xian about the so-called power. Power was the level of Jinqi cultivation in a person's body, but power contained too many things such as an aura and specific techniques. Sword techniques, without question, had to be included in power. What Sigu Jian was talking about now had already surpassed the scope of power. It is the heart and the will. When your power has reached its peak, what you need to break through is the heart and the will, Sigu Jian said coldly. He then raised his head to gaze at the large tree above his head. In an instant, the sword intent in his eyes pierced the sky. The countless birds and insects in the big green tree sensitively felt the killing intent that filled the heaven and earth. They fled in panic and let out countless bird cries and insect cries. It was extremely mournful. The birds turned into countless black dots and flew out from the deep green canopy, heading straight for the clouds under the sky. They wanted to get as far away from this place as possible. Sigu Jian's voice grew lower and lower. A person is not a god. His physical body is a vessel. In the end there is a limit. The cultivation of Jinchi and the increase of the real realm will stop when it reaches a certain stage, a stage where the body and meridians cannot hold it. If one continues to forcefully cultivate and increase it, it will only cause their meridians to break and they will become useless. Of course, rising another foot above the Blue Sea realm is already at the upper 9th level. If one wants to increase it further, it is a very difficult matter. Sigu Jian's eyes continued to gaze calmly at the green treetop. Fan Xian and the little emperor listened quietly to the side. The atmosphere was slightly strange. The little emperor was not a martial ace, so she did not understand. However, Fan Xian immediately captured the true meaning within. Regardless of whether it was Lang Tiao Yunjilan or himself, they had all entered the upper 9th level realm. However, they could no longer increase their cultivation because they had already reached the limits of the human body. No matter how much they cultivated, they could only maintain themselves in this realm. Reality is the water in a jar. The power is the way the water is sprinkled, Sigu Jian said slowly. Sigu Jian leisurely said, a jar of water will never be able to nourish 10,000 acres of fertile land. This is the so-called limit. If you cannot break through the boundaries of power, you can forever only sprinkle water one ladle at a time. You cannot change your pettiness. No matter how many sword techniques you learn, there is only so much of the source. Of course, you cannot experience the feeling of a river bursting its banks. Thus, the most important thing is still the Jinchi in the body, Fan Xian unconsciously replied. Fan Xian unconsciously followed up. He thought of the unfathomable way of the Emperor's Jinchi in the Emperor's body. Between realms, there is always a balance and mutual restriction. Reality is indeed the most important thing. If you cannot grasp a method to release the reality in your body, it is impossible for you to have an extraordinary reality. Just like if a river bursts its banks, if you cannot control the flow of the river water, the mysterious heavens will certainly not grant you a river. Sigu Jian smiled mockingly. The heavens have the virtue of cherishing life and will not let a person die so easily. This saying is too idealistic. Furthermore, I have suddenly realized that although you have raised the most warriors in the world in terms of teaching students, you are actually about the same as Uncle Wuzhu. Fan Xian sighed. He thought to himself that what Sigu Jian said was very reasonable. It was just nonsense. Without a method to control the Jinchi in the body, the self-restraint of the human body would not allow the Jinchi to expand limitlessly. If one could not increase the Jinchi beyond that critical point, it would be impossible to grasp such a mysterious method. It was truly nonsense. Furthermore, it was a proposition that did not make sense. Because the Jinchi in the body is no longer at a level that the human body can tolerate and has already left the boundaries of the mortal world, the method to control this kind of Jinchi should not be something that humans have. Sigu Jian pulled his gaze back from above and looked at Fan Xian coldly. This is a very natural principle. Then how do you solve this problem? You must first find a method that does not belong to the mortal world. Perhaps it was because Sigu Jian had pulled his gaze back, but the wind on the tree had stopped. The leaves swayed gently. The young birds and bugs that had not been able to escape the tree in time sank into silence with the joy of escaping death. It is precisely the will and will I spoke of earlier. Sigu Jian looked into Fan Xian's eyes. He didn't know how much this young man could comprehend. Slowly he said, extraordinary strength can only appear in this world through extraordinary methods. You have to forget everything you have ever learned. Little tricks, coffin breaker, Sigu sword, tyrannical methods, Tianyi Dao methods. You have to forget all of these methods that can capture traces. As long as there are traces, there must be a reason to follow. However, the true power of the great Grandmaster realm truly does not have any reason. The pupils in Sigu Jian's eyes gradually constricted. Looking at Fan Xian, he said in a stern voice, you have to forget that you are a person. You have to forget that you have hands and feet. You have to forget the hair on your body and the soreness in your bones. Don't try to use any methods that your body can control to calm the Jinchi in your body. Only the will and will can cast aside the restrictions of the physical body. Sigu Jian's voice gradually became lower, but it was like countless bells ringing in Fan Xian's heart. Take off your clothes. Taking off his clothes, Fan Xian's heart felt like it had been struck by lightning. Sweat suddenly seeped out of his body and completely soaked his clothes. He was familiar with these words because it was a passage from the records of old sayings, in the 5 classics. When Master Kuhi's teacher, Master Genshin, was comprehending the way, he had once shouted, the human body is the undershirt. Only by taking it off is the path of the way. On the precipice in Danzhou, at the most crucial moment of his cultivation of the tyrannical martial method, Uncle Wuzhu had smashed his staff into his head and also shouted these words. Unexpectedly, he had heard these words again from Sigujian's mouth. There seemed to be the will of heaven in the unseen world. It was also proving to Fan Xian the deep meaning of these words. It was as if it was showing him a completely new, mysterious, immeasurable and charming realm. After this great Grandmaster Sigujian finished speaking, he didn't speak again. He sat calmly and silently under the tree. Fan Xian's body was covered in cold sweat. He faintly knew he understood something, but in reality he didn't understand anything. He knew what Sigujian said was true and correct. However, this kind of method was too vague and indiscernible. There was no way to find it. Most importantly, such an idealistic way of speaking was completely different from the tyrannical martial method he had cultivated since he was a child. Without a person as a bridge, could he affect this real world with just his thoughts? What was different about man's existence in the world from all things? It was in the word thoughts. Man was the spirit of all things. He could speak and think. He could watch flowers bloom and feel joy. He could watch flowers fall and feel sorrow. He could watch the full and waning of the moon and feel the eternal vicissitudes of heaven and earth. He could watch the rise and fall of the tides and feel the impermanence of life. The old men with their heads bent in the yellow earth also knew the joy of shadow puppets. It was an instinctive pleasure to follow Pan Lang through the night. It could also affect one's thoughts in a way that left one's instincts or substance. A powerful official with unparalleled evil could sit in seclusion for half a day, write a painting, and be proud of himself for a long time. He was moved to tears. No creature was more complicated than humans. Only humans could have such rich emotions and thoughts that could not be forgotten in a moment. Heaven and earth were indifferent. Spectators lived and died. Only humans could look back at heaven and earth and faintly connect their thoughts. The sweat on Fan Xian's body gradually dried. He knew how admirable that realm was. He also knew that it was not a realm that could be reached just because he wanted to. He asked in a raspy voice, "The true Sigujian does not need a sword. How will you teach me? This method cannot be passed on. It's not that I don't want to pass it on. It's that I cannot pass it on." Sigujian broke the silence and coldly said, "Today you will wander with me through Dongyi. I can only let you see. As for how much you can experience, it will all depend on your luck." Fan Xian bowed sincerely and said, "I am willing to lead the way for you." The little emperor stood beside the two of them with her eyes closed. Her eyelids trembled anxiously. It looked like she was trying to memorize every word of their conversation. Sigujian did not pay attention to what these two young people were thinking. He indicated for Fan Xian to push his wheelchair away from the tree and toward the bustling interior of Dongyi. At some point, perhaps it was the moment Sigujian raised his head to look at the sky, the people under the tree had long scattered in all directions in fear. It was completely silent under the tree. There was only a faint shadow enveloping the ground under the tree. Chapter 641. When three people walk together, there will always be a teacher. Fan Xian and the little emperor pushed Sigujian and quietly left the tree. Following the long straight path, they entered Dongyi's busiest street. The travelers who had been resting under the tree had long scattered in all directions in shock. Slowly, the scene they had seen earlier reached the ears of many people. Not many people had discovered who the cripple sitting on the wheel of the chair was. Sigujian was Dongyi's god. Not many mortals had seen him before. The pedestrians on the street only felt that the combination of these three people was a little strange. Two very handsome young men were pushing a disabled person in a wheelchair. They didn't look like merchants who were here to buy or sell goods, nor did they look like tourists who came because of the fame. Fan Xian paid no attention to the gazes around him. He just quietly pushed the wheelchair. His gaze naturally fell on Sigujian's shoulder. In the back of his head, he carefully thought back to the Grandmaster realm he had felt under the tree earlier. He was a person who loved to learn. When he had escorted Xiao En back to Northern Qi, he had not forgotten to ask Xiao En about court matters. Although there was an unspeakable grudge between him and Sigujian, their relationship was incomparably complicated and subtle. Since this great Grandmaster was willing to reveal this realm to him and give him a chance to study it, he would not pass it up. Even though Sigujian's action hid a dangerous murderous intent, Fan Xian still did not want to pass it up. Perhaps for just one day in Dongyi, he was willing to see Sigujian as his true teacher. Of the three of them, only the Northern Qi Emperor's situation was awkward. She seemed to be Sigujian's guest, but in reality she was only a hostage in Fan Xian's hands. At this moment she was purely a traveling companion. She was unable to understand the silent communication between Sigujian and Fan Xian. She could only watch helplessly and say nothing. After leaving the tree, Sigurd did not bring up those profound words again. Fan Xian also did not ask him seriously for guidance. It was as if the two of them had forgotten what they had talked about earlier and what they wanted to do. They only quietly and freely strolled through Dongyi, walking amidst the gazes and whispers of the people around them. Just as Sigurd had said, there were many things that could only be understood and not conveyed. Since it was so, there was no benefit in saying more, so it was better not to say it. After walking for a while, perhaps Fan Xian noticed the little emperor's uneasiness. He glanced at her with a slight smile and quietly said something. A strange smile rose to the little emperor's cold face. Sigurd took the two juniors to some old and run-down buildings. They were the places where the Yi family had made their fortune many years ago. Now they had long been used for other purposes. The people who lived there would never have thought that the greatest merchant in the world had once lived in these rooms. Fan Xian knew what Sigurd wanted to tell him and what he wanted to influence him, but he maintained his silence. It was not until they reached the Yi family's glass workshop that he quietly asked, "Later on you became the protector of Dongyi. Why did Yi Qing or my mother leave with Uncle Wu Zhu?" Fan Xian knew that period of history. After Yi Qingmei and Wu Zhu left Dongyi, they did not enter the surrounding vassal states. Instead they found their way south of Dongyi and north of Danzhou. They found a path between the precipitous cliffs in that wild and primitive forest and went directly to Danzhou. That path was like a sheep's intestines and heavenly stairs. It was difficult to walk, but it was still a path. During the Dong Mountain incident 3 years ago, Yin Xiaoyi had used this path to sneak out and surround Dong Mountain with 5,000 soldiers. After the incident, regardless of whether it was the Qing kingdom or Dongyi, they all invested boundless enthusiasm and caution into this secret path. Both sides placed heavy troops on both ends of the path. Fan Xian did not care about this path. He only cared about why Yi Qingmei had left Dongyi. By the seaside in Danzhou, Yi Qingmei had met the emperor, his father, and that old man Qin Pingping. From then on, the glorious career of the Qing kingdom's Gang of Four began. At that time, I had just taken over the city lord's manor. The sword hut had just opened. There was an uncontrollable anger in his cold words. Your mother's departure had nothing to do with whether or not I was powerful. It only had to do with whether or not Dongyi was powerful. She was ambitious. The things she wanted to do had to rely on an even more powerful power in order to spread through the world. Sigurd turned his head and glanced at Fan Xian. In an icy voice he said, in her opinion, Dongyi's power was not enough to support her thoughts. Fan Xian silently pushed the wheelchair. He understood what was going on. Since Yi Qingmei had chosen to enter the world in Dongyi because she pitied the suffering of the people, this idealistic woman who had once shone with boundless light would certainly think of a way to perfect this matter. Although Dongyi was located by the sea and had gathered all the wealth in the world, it was once a territory of the Wei Kingdom. Its position in the land was not very prominent. Most importantly, the people in Dongyi made their living as merchants. They were more than clever, but they were not very stubborn. If they wanted to create something big and use their own ideals to influence the entire world, Dongyi was, without question, not a good choice. Why didn't she go to northern Qi? Yes, it was the Wei Kingdom. The northern Qi emperor, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly interjected, causing Fan Xian and Sigurd to glance at her at the same time. She sighed helplessly and said, "I can't be mute all day." The reason the little emperor couldn't resist asking this question was simple. Before hearing today's story as the emperor of northern Qi, she already had a deep understanding of the Yi family, once the foremost family in the world. She had a faint sense of admiration for that Yi woman. Later, after she took over the government, she worked hard to collude with the Qing kingdom's Jiangnan palace treasury. She knew just how much influence the palace treasury could have on a country. Thus, she was very regretful and curious as to why Yi Qingmei had not gone to the Wei Kingdom, which was now her own country. If she had gone, perhaps Fan Xian would have been born in Shangjing. Perhaps northern Qi would not be as difficult as it was now. Of course, the biggest possibility was that Fan Xian would no longer exist in this world. Fan Xian smiled and explained in front of Sigurd, back then the Wei Kingdom controlled the entire land. It was the place where the feudal and decadent powers were most concentrated. Although it is said that a revolution should go to the most difficult place, in reality, it is not realistic. At that time, the Qing kingdom had already been at war with Shihu for many years. The power of the country was beginning to show signs of youth. However, it was only in a corner and did not attract much attention. Additionally, the Qing people's personalities were open and unyielding, so they were more receptive to new things. Thus, it was not surprising that Mother chose the Qing kingdom. After saying this, the little emperor furrowed her brows and shook her head unhappily. She thought to herself, what kind of nonsense is this? How come I clearly understand each word, but when put together, I don't know what he is talking about? Sigurd glanced at Fan Xian and said, it was for this reason that she left Dongyi and went to the Qing kingdom. She thought that the heir of the Qing kingdom would obediently listen to her. When the Qing kingdom unified the world, it would be the time she changed the world. Who would have thought that the heir would eventually become a true dragon in the world? How could he tolerate someone riding on his body? In the end, this great grandmaster could not suppress his laughter. There was a hint of joy in his laughter. Fan Xian was slightly angry in his heart. He stared at him coldly. Sigurd did not care about his gaze at all. Coldly he added, when I was young, I tasted countless joys and sorrows in the human world. I almost lost my life a number of times. Who knows how many of the servants and wet nurses who raised me died. Once I had power in my hands and my swordsmanship was beginning to form. When I entered the manor of the master of the city, I was determined to kill for revenge. However, I was stopped by your mother. Since your mother has left Dongyi and gone to the Qing kingdom, I can kill as I please. Sigurd lowered his head slightly. In one night, I massacred over 100 people in the manor. In one night, my aura was in chaos and my realm began to form. Of course, after that matter, your mother and I broke off any correspondence. From then on, we were strangers. Sigurd gently patted the armrest of the wheelchair. His words were filled with sorrow, hatred, and sharpness. Fan Xian mockingly said, don't tell me that things are still so common. Don't tell me you are also one of my mother's admirers? Sigurd mockingly said, no matter how beautiful she was or how capable she was in my eyes, she was still that little girl under the tree. I have no interest in strange things. In this life, I only love the sword in my hand. Fan Xian could clearly feel the long-suppressed resentment in Sigurd chest. Perhaps it was a sense of loneliness after being abandoned. Perhaps it was because this great grandmaster saw Yi Qingmei's heart-wrenching end but was powerless to change anything. Sigurd had gone to the Qing royal palace 3 times with the intention of assassinating the Qing emperor. Because of the grandmaster ace who never appeared in the royal palace, he had returned. He could not use his life as a gambling stake. His life represented the countless lives in Dongyi. Yet he still went to the Qing kingdom. Just this proved his power. Why did Sigurd want to assassinate the Qing emperor? In the past, perhaps people thought that under the threat of the Qing kingdom, Dongyi was like a bird's nest in a storm and could be destroyed at any moment. Thus, this great grandmaster who used the sword tried to use his powerful martial power to change the course of history. After hearing so many stories and seeing so many of the marks Yi Qingmei had left in Dongyi, a different thought suddenly welled up in Fan Xian's heart. Perhaps Sigurd wanted to assassinate the Qing emperor because he was angry at the Qing emperor for not protecting Yi Qingmei. The 3 of them gradually became silent again. It was impossible for Fan Xian to express his gratitude to Sigurd for assassinating the emperor. The little emperor also could not say to himself that he had a good time today. Sigurd expression also became stern. It was hard to tell whether he was happy or angry. The 2 of them didn't disturb him. The wheelchair rolled along the streets of Dongyi. The creaking was crisp and clear. It was as if it could travel along the long streets all the way to the harbor at the end. It could even travel to the ships and then be taken to other unfamiliar places in this world. Fan Xian suddenly raised his head. A clear light appeared in his eyes as he scanned his surroundings. What startled him from his thoughts was the clear and terrifying creaking sound beneath him. It was daytime. In his observations 2 days ago, it should be the busiest time in Dongyi. Merchants selling goods, travelers from afar, and sightseeing guests would all crowd here and make a racket. Why was it so quiet now? Even the creaking of the wheelchair could travel so far? He looked at the scene in front of him and took a deep breath. His face was slightly pale. His heart was filled with shock. The expression of the northern Qi emperor, who was pushing the wheelchair beside him, also changed slightly. Although she had seen such a scene countless times in her life, suddenly seeing it today still made her feel indescribably shocked. There was not a single person on the street. There wasn't even a scrap of paper. There were only green stone slabs, pieced together into the distance. All of the merchants and travelers were squeezed under the eaves on the 2 sides of the street. They knelt on the ground and bowed toward the center of the clean street, not moving at all. The little emperor knew that these foreign people were not bowing to her. They could only be bowing to the great grandmaster in the wheelchair. She couldn't resist looking at Sigurd shoulder with a questioning gaze. Only now did she know that Sigurd position in the hearts of the Dongyi people was even higher than that of an emperor. There were no soldiers to suppress them or open up a path. Everyone prostrated to the ground and bowed toward Sigu Jian in the wheelchair. It was like they were looking at the god in their hearts as they slowly walked toward the end of the street. Everyone in the world knew that this great grandmaster was about to die. Not many people in Dongi had seen this great grandmaster's true face. During these 2 years they still couldn't help but feel terrified and uneasy. Particularly now that they had truly seen the great grandmaster in the wheelchair, endless sorrow grew in the hearts of the Dongi people. They knew that it was this crippled person in the wheelchair who had used the sword in his hand to protect their wealth, their freedom, and the decades of peace in their homes. A sense of shame even grew in their hearts. They felt that it was shameful to live under the protection of the Sword Saint for so many years. The Sword Saint was tired and old. A god gradually grew old and would eventually die. Just like the sun across the street, there would be a moment when it would sink into endless darkness. It looked like the moment under the tree had finally spread and startled all of the people in Dongi. They knew that the Sword Saint had finally come out of the hut and had come among them. That was why they were prostrating on the ground and feeling sorrow in their hearts. They were making this final farewell to express their gratitude. Fan Xian looked at this scene and felt a strange doubt in his heart. How did these people know that the person in the wheelchair was Sigu Jian? There was no time to think. He had already sensed the powerful aura emanating from Sigu Jian's small body. It was an aura that pushed people thousands of li away. It was an aura of absolute coldness. It was a completely different aura from the tens of thousands of people prostrating on the sides of the long street. Fan Xian was silent. He knew that this great grandmaster was giving him a second lesson. He didn't use words, only his actions. He used the shocking and sorrowful scene on the long street to tell him that in order to enter the realm of a great grandmaster, he not only had to take off his clothes, but he also had to abandon his emotions. It was not that he was heartless. Sigu Jian's feelings for this large city were probably already very deep, which was why he appeared so cold and heartless. He was somewhat dismissive of the emotions the people of the secular world poured into him. Emotions are very precious things, but they are also very cheap things, Sigu Jian said for the first time on the long street. These were Sigu Jian's first words on the long street. If you have feelings for something, then you cannot be controlled by this feeling. And this is your mother's biggest problem. Fan Xian and the little emperor were deep in thought as they pushed the wheelchair forward under the worshipful gazes of tens of thousands of people. The creaking of the wheelchair grew louder and more ear-piercing. Then the wheelchair stopped in front of a beautiful building. It was the manor of the master of the city that Fan Xian had come to yesterday. What are we doing here? Fan Xian asked respectfully. Chapter 642. I don't know why, but I felt very tired these past few days. I've wanted to sleep every day. Is this the legendary autumn sleepiness? If everyone thinks this chapter is passable, throw in 2 monthly votes and praise it. I still want to keep up with the large group of monthly votes. Many thanks, many thanks. After the wheelchair entered the manor of the master of the city, the street outside remained absolutely silent. Although the people of Dongi straightened their bodies from under the eaves, no one left. No one discussed. They only looked fearfully and uneasily in the direction of the manor of the master of the city. Countless gazes were focused in that direction. They didn't know what was happening inside or why the Sword Saint had come alone to the manor of the master of the city. It was to kill. Regardless of whether Sigu Jian, the great grandmaster, decided to tie Dongi to someone's carriage or step onto someone's road before he died, whether it was north or south, it was all his decision. All of Dongi, including the surrounding vassal states that had submitted, had to follow his will. Although this great grandmaster was about to leave, he still would not allow anyone in his domain to secretly have disloyal thoughts and collude with the disciples of the hut. Before he made his own decision, they would arrogantly make a decision for him, deciding the direction of Dongi and the life and death of countless people in the city. This was within the scope of a god's work. No mortal could interfere, not even the eldest disciple of the sword hut or the manor of the master of the city who maintained daily order in Dongi. The master of the city was the last distant relative Sigu Jian could find in a remote and desolate place after he had massacred his clan. Those who went against him would die without a doubt. This was the so-called will of a grandmaster. This did not need to be emphasized. It was just a natural bottom-line principle. It was only for Fan Xian to see it more clearly that Sigu Jian had brought him here. After the little emperor stepped into the manor of the master of the city, her face became very pale. It was as if she was about to become transparent. There was a sense of loss and shock that could not be erased in her eyes. She knew what Sigu Jian wanted to do. Other than Yun Jilan, Northern Qi's greatest support in Dongyi was the people in the manor of the master of the city. The little emperor had been hoping that these two powers could help her convince Sigujien and have Dongyi leave the Qing kingdom's control. If Sigujien was going to wash the manor in blood, it showed his attitude. The little emperor felt slightly dizzy. Tightly biting her lower lip, she stood silently behind the wheelchair. Fan Xian glanced at her calmly. Seeing the paleness of her face, his heart jumped slightly. He reached out and patted her shoulder to express his comfort. This was not the consolation of a victor to a loser. It was just that his heart had been pierced by the sword intent of the expert in the wheelchair, causing his eyes to blink uncontrollably. After Sigujien entered the manor, the emotion in his eyes gradually became indifferent. There wasn't even a glimmer of coldness. Several people knelt down at the stone steps of the second gate of the city lord's mansion and welcomed the arrival of the sword saint in fear and trepidation. They lowered their heads and kowtowed. With this kowtow, their heads were like fruits ripening in autumn. Breaking their branches, they fell and rolled on the ground. There was an extremely smooth cut on their necks, as if they had been cut by an unparalleled sharp sword. Sigujien in the wheelchair did not have a sword in his hand. The little emperor stared at the rolling heads on the ground. Her face grew paler and paler. Even her tightly pressed lips became whiter. Fan Xian's hand tightened slightly as he held onto the wheelchair. The veins on it were faintly visible. A drop of cold sweat dripped down from his forehead. He knew Sigujien had come to kill and teach him how to kill. He had not thought that this great grandmaster would only need to think for a few lives to cease to exist in this world. The heads rolled to the side, drawing out a streak of blood. They crashed into the moss in the corner of the wall and stopped. Fan Xian's lips were a little dry. He unconsciously wanted to stop Sigujien's following actions. He tightened his hand, intending to stop the wheelchair at the bottom of the stone steps. If the manor of the master of the city was massacred, it would make the agreement between the Qing kingdom and Dongyi without any power to oppose it. Even the disciples of the sword hut who did not agree with Sigujien's will would, because of the blood, once again experience the ruthlessness and power of their sword saint teacher. Fan Xian still did not want to use such a method. He was not a sentimental and pedantic person. However, he thought that the manor of the master of the city would never be a major obstacle. As long as Sigujien nodded, there were many ways to resolve the problem here. He had not thought that Sigujien would use the simplest and crudest method to resolve it. At some point, the wheelchair had already climbed up the stone steps and was moving toward the depths of the manor. Fan Xian and the little emperor's hands were still on the wheelchair. Their hands trembled more and more. Their faces grew paler and paler. They saw more and more blood and more corpses on either side of the wheelchair. Someone finally summoned the courage to pull out a knife. The knife broke in two. Someone screamed and flew away, their waist broken in two. Even more people looked with terrified eyes at the killing god in the wheelchair. Their legs trembled. They could not move at all. They thought of the legend from many years ago. On that night, the great grandmaster in the wheelchair held a sword and entered the manor of the master of the city. The next day, not a single living person could be found in the manor. After many years, Sigujien entered the manor again. This time he did not have a sword in his hand. The entire manor was still sadly enveloped by a thick stench of blood. Fan Xian's face grew paler and paler. The tyrannical Jinqi in his body had been raised to the limit. The moment it left his body, it was crushed into threads by the killing aura that filled the world outside. It broke into pieces and dissipated in an instant. It was impossible to gather the qi. The little emperor's body trembled. She was unable to move at all. She had to place her hand on the wheelchair to barely stabilize her body. Even though she was a powerful female emperor, looking at the countless heads and broken corpses flying through the air, it was still difficult for her to resist the onslaught of this bloody killing aura. Blood flew. Blood continued to fly. Blood continued to fly. Sigujien's face was even paler than these two young men's faces. It was a completely illogical white. It was as if all the blood in his body had flowed to some place and then dispersed into a sword qi that pierced the heavens and slaughtered the earth, and a murderous aura that could destroy the heavens and destroy the earth. It was being released freely. Fan Xian and the little emperor's bodies seemed to have left the control of their minds. They followed this life-taking wheelchair with great passivity as they walked through the manor. The powerful aura emanating from Sigujien's body completely controlled all the minute movements around them. The little emperor was powerless to resist, so her reaction was slightly weaker. Fan Xian forcefully focused his mind, wanting to resist this cold, murderous intent that made him feel very uncomfortable and even disgusting. It was as if he was being hammered endlessly by a heavy hammer, shaking his heart and soul with each blow. A thread of blood seeped out from the corner of his lips. A helpless sorrow flashed through his eyes. He lowered his eyelids slightly, no longer looking at everything that was happening in the manor. He gave up on the thought of stopping Sigujien from killing. He didn't have this power. He also didn't want to take pity on the innocent servants in the manor and anger a great grandmaster who had already sunk into a crazed state and sink himself into endless danger. His eyelids were slightly lowered. He didn't look, but that didn't mean he didn't know, particularly since this was the last lesson Sigujien was giving him. Fan Xian had already relaxed his mind and was no longer fighting head-on against the sword intent that filled the manor. Thus, he could more and more clearly sense any slight change in aura present. He had a deeper understanding of the aura emanating from the great grandmaster's body in the wheelchair. This aura caused him to frown because he detested this aura. Not only did this aura reek of blood, but it was also devoid of emotions. There was only indifference, a kind of indifference that came from looking down on others. It was an indifference that came from looking down on all living things. It was as if in front of Sigujien's eyes and thoughts, there was nothing in the world worthy of being treasured. Everyone could be treated like pigs or dogs. However, Fan Xian didn't understand. This great grandmaster clearly had great affection for Dongi. Immediately after, Fan Xian sensed the other realm that the aura represented. It was willpower. Sigujien's willpower had already controlled everything around the wheelchair. It was valiant, decisive, and unyielding. All morals, standards, the benevolence of heaven and earth, and the thoughts of the young man behind him became bubbles and floated away in all directions in front of this powerful and absolute willpower. Fan Xian abruptly raised his head. With one hand, he supported the little emperor, who was already tottering under this pressure. His eyes quietly followed Sigujien's gaze and looked into the manor. He experienced this realm, but he unconsciously feared it. There were no great grandmasters in the world. The reason the four strange creatures were able to break through the limits of humans and move freely between heaven and earth was because of their own understanding of heaven and earth. Their own experiences created the four great grandmasters completely different paths of breakthrough. The Qing Emperor had broken into the realm of a great grandmaster. It was clear that he had taken a very practical path. A cripple with all the meridians in his body shattered had reached a realm of joy. Without the limits of meridians, the power in his body had increased without limit. Using the most difficult method, he had broken through the limits that heaven had created for the human body. Without question, this was the most valiant method. No matter what, Fan Xian did not dare to learn it. He had no way to learn it. Sigujien's path was different. Since his youth, there had been too much gloom, too much suppression, and too much impulse to kill. Finally, after one night of massacring his entire clan, he had condensed a powerful state of mind from the stench of blood. In the instant he had severed his emotions and nature, he had finally comprehended a will that would not be moved by external things. Using killing and coldness, he began to look coldly at the line in the sky and easily tear it apart. On the last stone step in the manor of the master of the city stood a row of people. The master of Dongi wore a magnificent clan uniform. His face was deathly pale. He stood in a line with the people closest to him, waiting for the arrival of the sword saint. He had gathered his most powerful strength here, but he also knew that it was impossible to stop a great grandmaster from killing people. Fan Xian's hand was on the back of the wheelchair. He did not notice the silence on the stone steps. The wretched cries gradually stopped. He had only sunk into a dazed state. He had finally experienced Sigujien's great grandmaster realm. He discovered that the method to search for this realm was perhaps something he would never be able to do. Every blade of grass, stone, flower, and tree in the world had its own reason for surviving. Each person was unique. If one wanted to break through the realm and touch the great grandmaster realm, they would probably have to find a method that truly belonged to them. In the wheelchair, Sigujien suddenly began to cough. He coughed until his small body bounced on the wheelchair. He coughed until Fan Xian's hand, which was holding the wheelchair, began to tremble again. The row of aces from the manor of the master of the city on the stone steps saw this scene. They turned into black shadows that filled the sky and split into 7 directions. Like eagles swooping to kill, they leapt toward the wheelchair. The coughing seemed to be an opportunity and a secret signal. The aces from the manor of the master of the city did not hesitate and attacked explosively. However, there was no joy in their hearts. The people of Dongi, including the aces who practiced swordsmanship by the seaside, were all used to the undefeatable sword saint. After decades of divine light, no one had the extravagant hope that they could become the person who killed a god. However, they still had to carry out the final attack. After all, the Sword Saint had coughed. Perhaps it was an opportunity. Perhaps it was not. Since they were going to die under the hands of a great grandmaster should be a kind of glory. Before the shadows arrived, a gust of wind had already hit them in the face. The aces from the manor of the master of the city did not target the two young people behind the wheelchair. They had long seen that these two young people had already sunk into a mental predicament that they could not extricate themselves from. Fan Xian had a feeling that if he was faced with these aces' most heroic attack before death, he would probably have no way to counterattack. Sigu Jian was still curled up in the wheelchair coughing. His remaining hand covered his mouth. There was no sword by his side. Therefore he waved his hand and a sword on the ground moved. It moved extremely quickly like a bolt of lightning and arrived in his steady palm. Sigu Jian swung his sword. The power of the sword was not perfect. It was like 7 green mountain peaks suddenly tearing off the outer bark of the tree to reveal the strange, craggy and thorn-like rocks underneath. It was as if they were going to pierce 7 large holes in the sky. Faced with the last 7 aces from the manor of the master of the city, Sigu Jian casually stabbed out with his sword. With a valiant, indifferent and bloodthirsty willpower, he stabbed out 4 times in 7 different directions. This was already a strike that surpassed the secular world. It contained an aura that focused only on the front and not on the back. Hidden behind the aura was a supreme willpower that transcended the aura. It was free because of its coldness and indifference because of its bloodthirst. The 4 swords stabbed into 7 people. The 7 aces collapsed to the ground without a sound. Sigu Jian waved his sleeve. The common steel sword in his hand left his hand and pierced straight into the chest of the master of Dongyi. After Sigu Jian entered the manor in a wheelchair, the master of Dongyi did not make a single argument or sigh. He only calmly watched the scene in front of him and waited for death to come. He knew that since his distant uncle had personally come out of the hut, then only death awaited him. Toward a crazy great grandmaster, a bloodthirsty sword saint, and a heartless monster who had slaughtered his entire clan, the master of the city had no emotion. The master of the city coughed up blood. Feeling his life leave him, he began to cry. In the moment before his death, perhaps there was too much dissatisfaction and resentment in his heart, just like the resentment the Qing Emperor had felt many years ago. There should not have been these great grandmasters in this world. There was too much logic in this world. Fan Xian had watched Sigu Jian attack seriously. This was the first time Sigu Jian had truly attacked since entering the manor. He had a sword in his hand. His gaze was very sharp. He had captured the method and trajectory of the last 4 swords. Thus, his heart was incomparably shocked. This was the true Sigu sword. Like a bird in the sky, like a fish in the water, between one movement and one stillness, there was no warning at all. He only attacked based on his heart. It was not just a valiant act of looking ahead and not caring about the back, looking left and not caring about the right. The 4 swords were elegant and cold to the extreme. One glance could topple a city, the second glance could topple a country, and the third glance troubled the plans of the world. It made a hero cry. Pulling out his sword, Sigu Jian's heart was at a loss. He did not see the ancients before or after. He watched the long passage of heaven and earth and cried alone. In Suzhou, Yi Luyun had once split half a building with one strike. Fan Xian had thought that the pinnacle of sword skill in the world was nothing more than this. Seeing Sigu Jian attack, only now did he know that the most powerful symbol of a killing weapon like the sword was the connection between the sword and the heart. There was no faster method of expression in the world than the heart. Where the heart was, the tip of the sword was. To be able to cultivate a sword technique that defied the common sense of heaven and earth and should not exist in this world, even the person controlling the sword would feel a glimmer of awe. Even the person controlling the sword probably didn't know how he was able to use such a sword technique. After one strike, the swordsman held the blood-dripping sword in his hand and looked around at the boundless wilderness with a sense of loss. The true meaning of the Sigu sword in the end was still a sense of loss. Fan Xian's hand continued to hold the little emperor's arm, but he couldn't stop it from trembling. To be able to comprehend such a sword technique, what a fortunate or painful thing it was. On an unknown tree by the master of the city's manor, a crow that had been curled up and peeping for half a day finally could no longer withstand the will that filled heaven and earth. With a caw it flew away. Sigu Jian's eyes were cold. He coughed up blood at the corner of his mouth. His face was terrifyingly pale. His small and thin body was completely curled up in the wheelchair. Of the 2 young people behind him, one was at a loss and the other was stern. Beside them were pools of blood and corpses. Fan Xian lowered his head. A strange thought surged in his heart. He seemed to be able to sense that the great grandmaster in the wheelchair had reached the end of his life. In the end he had still pulled out his sword. Although these 4 strikes were beautiful and cruel, compared to 3 years ago on Dong Mountain, when Sigujien had killed 100 tiger guards with 1 strike, the Sigujien now was clearly much weaker. The body of the master of Dongyi slowly knelt down in front of the wheelchair. It was as if he was expressing his final submission. Fan Xian abruptly raised his head and watched in shock as a black-clothed man appeared in front of the 3 of them as the master of the city's body fell. Chapter 643. The black-clothed man was the shadow. Of course he was the shadow. He and Fan Xian quietly entered Dongyi. After arranging everything with the subordinates of the Overwatch Council, they disappeared. When Fan Xian charged into the sword hut he was not there. Fan Xian knew what the head of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council would do once he saw Sigujien. Suddenly, the shadow appeared in the manor behind the body of the master of the city. Sigujien had massacred the manor again. No one knew how many people he had killed. Regardless of whether they were alive or dead, as long as his physical body existed, there would always be a shadow under the sunlight. The shadow was hidden in these shadows. To be able to hide from a great grandmaster's perception, suddenly appear in front of the 3 of them, and capture Sigujien's weakest moment, the shadow was the most powerful assassin in the world. Without question, the cultivation of the shadow, the most powerful assassin in the world, had risen to the pinnacle of his life. Sigujien coughed up blood on the wheelchair. His entire body trembled. His body shrunk slightly and his face was pale. Killing 7 people with 1 strike made the great grandmaster, who had forcefully dragged it on for nearly 3 years after being heavily injured, feel a glimmer of fatigue. What consumed the most of his energy was Fan Xian's hands, which were imbued with tyrannical jinqi, on the back of the wheelchair. From the moment he stepped into the manor, Fan Xian's intentions were in opposition to Sigujien's. Sigujien forcefully released his power and forcefully suppressed the will in Fan Xian's heart. However, Fan Xian was, after all, a 9th-level ace. Other than killing people, Sigujien still had to focus his thoughts on him and control his mind. It took too much time, so he couldn't help but feel a bit weak. Most importantly, it was the injury he had received on Dong Mountain 3 years ago. Yi Liuyun's claw had stretched out like a dragon in the clouds, and the Qing Emperor's earth-shattering way of the Emperor's killing fist had heavily injured Sigujien, a great grandmaster, to the point that he was on the verge of death. The shadow had chosen this moment to strike. He had chosen the most decisive moment. In his hand was an ancient sword that was as cold as autumn water. In an instant, the light of the sword lit up the entire manor. In the next moment, the stone steps seemed to become as sparkling and translucent as jade. The shadow's toes stepped on these jade-like stone steps. With each step he seemed to become a little brighter. Occasionally, a few green leaves would fly up at this time, accompanying the autumn wind and rain sword in his hand, adding a bit of sternness. Go. The ancient sword in the shadow's hand pierced towards Sigujien's chest. The strike was extremely simple. There were no changes, no accumulation of power, and not even the slightest tremble. In the process of the high-speed thrust, the bright sword body was calm like autumn water, stabbing forward smoothly. It was just a bend of the elbow, a flat wrist, and a thrust. It was the simplest sword move in the world. Because it was simple, it was focused and powerful. The shadow did not need to accumulate power, because he had been waiting for this sword for more than 20 years. He had been accumulating power for more than 20 years. It was too fast. When Qingqing's leaves floated up, she was stunned to find that she had fallen behind the black-clothed man. It was so fast that the air in the manor didn't even have time to change after the ancient sword sliced through its body. It let out a whistling wind. Because it was fast, the surrounding environment didn't have time to change. The courtyard was still silent. The only thing that changed was the position of the shadow, the tip of his feet stepping on the jade steps, the light on his body, and the brightest sword at the front of the light. The tip of the sword was only a foot away from Sigujien's chest. A thunderous strike. In such a short amount of time, Fan Xian only had time to narrow his eyes a little. He recognized the sword in the shadow's hand. When he had tried to assassinate the emperor in the Hanging Temple, the shadow had held this sword in his hand. Fan Xian even felt a sense of familiarity with the shadow's thunderous strike. Outside the Hanging Temple, under the tall building and against the golden chrysanthemums that covered the mountains and plains, the shadow had once jumped out of the sun in a white robe and pierced straight toward the emperor's face. That day the shadow had been dressed in white like an immortal from the heavens. He had shone brilliantly. With the plain ancient sword in his hand, he had floated down. Now the shadow was dressed in black and still held that plain ancient sword. The light on his body still shone wantonly, but it carried a coldness that came from the deepest depths of the earth. It was like a resentful spirit that had been imprisoned for tens of thousands of years and wanted to use this sword to release all of its resentment. Fan Xian's hand continued to hold the little emperor's waist. His pupils constricted slightly, but his body didn't have time to move. His heart was filled with shock. Stepping on the stone steps and crossing the green leaf, how unstoppable was this sword strike? How fast was it? It was so fast that even he couldn't react to it at all. It had even faintly broken through the limits of time. The shadow was the most powerful assassin in the world. He was the closest protector of the Overwatch Council's first and last masters in the night. After he escaped Dongyi, he had always been immersed in darkness and had never walked under the sun. Even when he was assassinating the emperor in the Hanging Temple, that seemingly brilliant strike actually contained care and caution. If the strike didn't hit, he would immediately retreat. And today's shadow was completely different from the shadow of the past. His entire being seemed to be immersed in darkness and negative emotions, but this sword strike was extremely open and aboveboard. His decades of cultivation were all condensed into this sword strike, and he didn't leave himself any path of retreat, He only wanted to advance. With boundless courage and determination he chose to advance. He only wanted to send this sword into Sigujian's chest. At this moment the shadow was no longer an assassin. He was a swordsman, a vengeful swordsman, a swordsman worthy of respect and admiration. The thunderous strike was softer than the wind, more traceless and faster. It was more dazzling and shocking than lightning. This was the most powerful strike the shadow could demonstrate. Regardless of whether it was Fan Xian, Haitang or anyone else, sitting in a wheelchair and suddenly facing this strike, they would probably not be able to escape. This was the first strike the shadow had truly struck out in 20 years. It was a strike that had been tempered countless times with the river of time, resentment, and netherworld emotions. In the final moment the tip of the sword broke through the air, it faintly reached another level. Just like what Sigujian had taught Fan Xian earlier, it could only be like this when one's heart was connected. Nothing was faster than a person's heart. No one's heart was more determined, darker, and brighter than the shadow's. The darkness was in hatred and complicated emotions. The brightness was in a determination to disregard everything. The muscles all over Fan Xian's body tightened. The tyrannical Jinqi in his body circulated quickly. As soon as his heart reacted, he was going to take the little emperor and escape this place. In front of such a strike he had no time to react. Sigujian could do it. Although he was already at the end of his life, had been heavily injured for 3 years, and had slaughtered the manor of the master of the city and used up a great deal of his energy, he was still a great grandmaster who could not be judged by common sense. However, Sigujian's expression was not the same as it had ever been. His face was extremely pale and his eyes were extremely bright. The right half of his face that had been shattered was like an ugly and terrifying god, emitting an awe-inspiring might. Even a great grandmaster would not underestimate such a strike. However, it was difficult for a great grandmaster to move. He only had one hand left. It seemed that the only thing he could move was this hand. Thus Sigujian moved. Raising his left arm, he spread out his index and middle fingers 4 inches in front of his chest and pressed them together. He used 2 fingers to clamp down on the thunderous strike. His face became even paler. His eyes became even brighter, and his expression became even more solemn. The strike between his 2 fingers was still advancing. The shadow was like Sigujian's shadow. Sticking closely to the wheelchair he let out a wild cry. Like he was crazy, crying, complaining, happy and angry he stepped on the path of escape 20 years ago. Holding the pain of his entire clan dying, his parents dying with him, he ruthlessly stabbed down. With a pop, the ancient sword, as cold as autumn water, rubbed against Sigujian's protruding knuckles and made a squeaking sound. It carried a heart-palpitating charred smell as it forcefully broke through Sigujian's finger sword and pierced into Sigujian's chest. The tip of the sword only entered 2 inches into the great grandmaster's body before it could move no further. Sigujian's eyes were already extremely bright. They were like 2 stars giving off light as they landed on the shadow's equally pale face. His fingers were like 2 large mountains holding the shadow's thunderous strike between the mountain rocks, unable to advance another inch. There was a moment of pause. The pale-faced Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt. Grabbing the waist of the little emperor beside him, he flew up diagonally like a large bird. Breaking away from the back of the wheelchair, he sliced through the air and floated toward the tree beside the manor. If he had remained behind the wheelchair, perhaps he would only be injured. The little emperor would certainly die from having her meridians severed under Sigu Jian and the shadow's double attack. Floating toward the tree, Fan Xian forcefully turned his head in the air with a pale face. He then saw a scene that he would never forget. Sigu Jian's face was very pale. The shadow's face was also very pale. These two brothers had not seen each other since that rainy night in Dongyi. Now they were tightly pressed together. Their cold faces reflected each other. It was not interesting. It only chilled one's heart. Their bodies were very close to each other. There was only a sword between them. On Sigu Jian's chest, the tip of the sword brought out a spray of fresh blood as it stubbornly tried to burrow in. It was like this great grandmaster did not feel anything at all. He only looked at the shadow with his bright and somewhat terrifying old eyes. The two fingers of his left hand held the sword steadily and terrifyingly. Well, thoughts just a glance. In an instant, the air in the courtyard of the city lord's mansion suddenly changed. It was as if countless wind blades had appeared out of nowhere, slicing through the air and emitting a chi-chi sound. They came from all directions, following a strange trajectory that could not be seen by the naked eye, and slashed towards the center of the city. They sliced toward the shadow's body. The shadow was still wearing the special robes of the Overwatch Council. This kind of clothing was a product the Third Bureau had developed for many years. Under the attack of the sword chi that filled the sky, it could only resist for a moment before it began to break apart weakly. Small holes opened up. The material of the clothing opened up like a baby's mouth. Countless holes appeared on the shadow's body in an instant. Blood began to seep out. Sigu Jian's true counterattack was not outside his body. Rather, it was inside the shadow's body. That powerful, cold, and bloodthirsty sword intent followed this finger and glance and mercilessly entered the shadow's body, causing his internal organs to tremble at the same time. Fresh blood seeped out of his body and flowed out along his lips. On the shadow's pale face, blood flowed endlessly from his lips. It flowed and did not flow. It was as if there would never be a moment to stop. However, the shadow did not show a glimmer of fear. On the contrary, he smiled. A trace of a bitter smile rose to his pale and ordinary face. His laughter rang through the surroundings of the manor. There was a crazed sobbing in his laughter. Ah! The shadow howled crazily like a wild beast crying in pain. He sent all the jinchi in his body into the sword in his hand. He did not care at all about the pain on his skin. He only cared about the distance between the tip of the sword and Sigu Jian's heart. A powerful wave of qi exploded between the two of them, shattering the leaves around the wheelchair into threads and turning them into nothing. In the end, the wheelchair was not a person's legs. Following the shadow's complete outburst, the wheelchair quickly retreated faster and faster. The sword between Sigu Jian's fingers was also moving at a very slow speed toward his body. Sigu Jian's face grew paler and paler, and his eyes grew brighter and brighter. The shadow's face also grew paler and paler. Fresh blood flowed from his lips faster and faster. A bloody path appeared on the ground. What Fan Xian saw was this scene. Two pale people, one vomiting blood and the other silent, were carrying out the craziest and calmest killing. His hand involuntarily began to tremble. He didn't like Sigu Jian. Naturally, he should help the shadow. However, if he wanted to attack, he would have already done so when he was behind Sigu Jian. Given Sigu Jian's crippled body, if Fan Xian and the shadow, two powerful warriors, attacked at the same time, there was a chance of success. The shadow would not be as bitter, sorrowful, or painful as he was now. However, Fan Xian still did not attack. He only trembled and coldly watched this scene. This had nothing to do with the agreement between the Qing Kingdom and Dongyi. It had nothing to do with Sigu Jian's past friendship with his mother, Uncle Wu Zhu and Sir Fei Jie. He had agreed to create an opportunity for the shadow to take revenge, but he would not participate in the process of the shadow's revenge. Although he didn't know what kind of past stories and secrets were behind the massacre of the master of Dongyi's manor, he respected the shadow. The shadow was a proud swordsman. At least today he was not facing his elder brother as an assassin. The pride of Dongyi was the eternal fear and pain in the shadow's heart. If Fan Xian attacked now, the shadow would not agree. Fan Xian understood this, so he chose to watch from the side, trembling as he watched. With a clatter, the wheelchair finally retreated to the back of the courtyard. Under the stone steps on the other side there was no way back. With such a high-speed collision, the wheelchair immediately broke into countless wooden shards. Covered in blood, the madness in the shadow's eyes flared. Finally, he pushed the sword in his hand forward another inch. For this inch of distance, the shadow had paid a great price. Sigu Jian's lips trembled. He laughed in a strange and raspy voice. Amidst the laughter, he who had fallen to the bottom of the stone steps exerted strength in his fingers. The sword stuck in his chest broke with a crack. The shadow did not laugh. The tip of the sword broke in Sigujian's chest. He still held the broken half of the sword in his hand. It seemed that his momentum did not stop for a moment. The broken half of the sword followed the trembling tip of the sword in Sigujian's chest and stabbed down again, piercing deeply into Sigujian's chest. From appearing behind the master of the city's body to stepping down the steps, stabbing into Sigujian's chest, retreating 30 meters toward the wheelchair, and finally stabbing down with the broken sword, the shadow's glowing thunderous strike was actually only one strike. It did not break. The unbroken sword intent continued to this day. It was the only strike. In this life, the shadow would only have one chance to use such a strike. The broken sword, which was not sharp, pierced into Sigujian's chest. It was not smooth. On the contrary, there was an astringent feeling. It was as if it was cutting through flesh. It was very painful, very painful. The shadow seemed to be able to feel the other party's pain because he himself was also in pain. His entire body trembled in pain. He lowered his head and silently stabbed and cut, severing the past from more than 20 years ago. At this moment, the shadow seemed to see many things. He saw that many years ago, that idiotic older brother of his had secretly built a small grass hut on a piece of wasteland on the outskirts of the city. Then he had proudly said that this place would be the holy land of martial arts in the future. He was still a child and looked disdainfully at the broken-down grass hut. He watched the blind man and woman who occasionally entered the grass hut. One day the child became interested in the sword. His idiot brother asked seriously, "Do you want to learn? If you want to learn, I can teach you." Learning the sword was a difficult and dry matter. The two brothers in the grass hut became idiots in everyone's eyes. Everyone said that perhaps the manner of the master of the city had offended the temple for there to be two idiots. No one in the manor paid attention to these two idiots. Perhaps something terrifying had happened at the time, but he didn't know. He was only a child. Then, on that night, everyone died. The person the child hated died, the person he loved died, the cat and dog he raised died, his brothers, sisters, uncles died. Even his parents who loved him so dearly died. Not a single person could survive. Only his entire body trembled as he stood behind the curtains of the mansion. He looked at the bloody sword in his idiotic big brother's hand and the pair of expressionless eyes. He began to feel afraid because he was sure that if he did not leave, this idiotic big brother would definitely kill him. That was perhaps the night Sigujian truly became a great grandmaster. It was also the night the youngest man in the manor began to flee for his life. From that night onwards, the shadow became a shadow. He could only live in the darkness forever and never saw a glimmer of sunlight again. His chest was filled with anger, hatred, resentment, and fear. He didn't dare sleep at night because each time he did, he always seemed to see that pair of expressionless eyes. Thus the shadow's face grew paler and paler. He knew that if he couldn't kill that person, he could only spend the rest of his life in darkness. That person had become a sword saint and the master of Dongi. Each time he heard this news, he felt that he could forever be that blood-covered, trembling, and silent child. Many years later, the sword that had accumulated 20 years of hatred, vengeance, and fear finally pierced into that person's body. This sword pierced through 20 years of time. Carrying incomparably complicated emotions, it finally tasted that person's blood. However, the shadow was not completely free. His entire body continued to tremble because he found that there was still so much blood on his body. Sigujian was still not dead. Sigujian's body was also covered in blood. However, it was unknown which was his and which was his brother's. The blood of brothers could often be exchanged, but it shouldn't be exchanged like this. The clothes on the two of them had been torn into countless pieces by the sword chi that crisscrossed the manor. They hung wretchedly on their bodies. Sigujian's eyelids drooped slightly as if he would soon be unable to open them. His small body, like the shadow, began to tremble violently. Sigujian's two fingers held the tip of the sword. Like lightning, he pulled it out and sliced toward the shadow's neck. The shadow did not dodge. The fingers of his left hand formed a sword and pierced toward the bloody hole that had appeared after the tip of the sword had been pulled out. A life for a life. It would not end until one of them died. With a muffled slap, the two people's bodies separated abruptly. The shadow was like a rock, kicking up a trail of dust. He quickly followed the bloody path back and crashed heavily into the stone steps. Coughing up blood endlessly, he found it difficult to stop breathing. Sigujianji sat on the other side of the stone steps. There was half of the broken sword on his chest. The other half of the sword tip was held between his fingers. He looked coldly at the shadow on the other side of the stone steps. A trickle of blood slowly trickled down from his lips. The courtyard of the master of the city's manor sank into a terrifying silence. Fan Xian and the little emperor stood far away under a tree, watching the scene of brothers killing each other with pale faces. The little emperor didn't know who the black-clothed man was, but she could see that his strength was extremely powerful. Otherwise, he would not have been able to last so long with Sigurjian. Fan Xian knew that in the end, it was the shadow who had lost. Although Sigurjian had reached the end of his rope, a great grandmaster was still a great grandmaster. As long as he still had a breath, he could still proudly stand at the pinnacle of martial arts in the world. Although he was constantly being blown by the mountain wind and was in constant danger of falling into the mundane world, in the end he still stood firm. However, the shadow should feel proud. Fan Xian's eyes were slightly moist. He also felt proud for him. A 9th level ace appeared powerful, but to be able to injure a great grandmaster into such a wretched state in a one-on-one duel was truly an exceptional performance. In the last moment, Sigurjian had already used his great grandmaster realm and powerful willpower to control the situation. It was clear he could have killed the shadow. Why didn't he do so? Did he feel pity for his own brother? Fan Xian did not believe that this bloodthirsty and murderous great grandmaster would have such a warm feeling. After the scene was silent for a long time, Sigurjian suddenly asked in a raspy voice, "If we count it seriously, you should be the first disciple of the Sword Hut." The shadow lay in a pool of blood and didn't reply. He only looked at him emotionlessly and unconsciously. Sigurjian coughed endlessly and said, "To be able to use such a strike as you did today, you should be proud." A moment later, the shadow suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Why?" Why had Sigurjian's temperament become deranged that year, killing in all directions, slaughtering his own clan, and not even sparing his own father and younger brother? This question had circled around the shadow's heart for many years. Under these circumstances he finally asked it. Sigurjian knew what he was asking and so did Fan Xian. However, Sigurjian did not answer the question. He only coldly said, "Those who stand in my way must die. You have followed us for a day and watched for a day. I had thought that you understood something by using that strike. Unexpectedly, you would still ask such a childish question. Little brother, you truly disappoint me." After these words were said, Fan Xian's heart jumped. Sigurjian had long sensed that the shadow had been following him. Sigurjian's teachings to him were not only targeted at him. He also hoped that the shadow spying in the dark would be able to sense something from it. The shadow was also silent. His ordinary eyes stared viciously at Sigurjian at the foot of the stone steps in the distance like a wild beast. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to debate what he should believe between the tragedy of the past and the words he said today. He only needed to confirm what he believed. Fan Xian followed the shadow's gaze and looked at the terrifying wound on Sigurjian's chest. It was a blur of flesh and blood with a faint green light glowing on it like some kind of poison. Miraculously, it maintained the last signs of life in the organs that should have rotted to death. This was the punch the Qing Emperor had given Sigurjian on Dong Mountain. Sigurjian should have died a long time ago, but he had been able to drag out his life until now. There had to be something hidden, particularly the terrifying wound on his chest. Sigurjian coldly used the last of his clothing to cover the wound on his abdomen. He glanced at the shadow and then at Fan Xian. He said his last words, "A swordsman is a lethal weapon. Only saints can use it." Fan Xian was silent. He immediately understood the meaning of Sigurjian's words. A swordsman was a lethal weapon. Only saints could use it. Saints were originally emotionless. Chapter 644. Yesterday the situation suddenly changed. The brothers on the leaderboard were all extremely anxious, chasing each other. It was abnormally lively. The one in front was sprinting, the one behind was leaping, and I was stuck in the middle. I was also anxious, 110,000 points of fire burning in my heart. But there was no use in being anxious. I couldn't update fast enough and I had to lower my head and admit it. Moreover, I really couldn't think of any reason to pull in the monthly votes. I couldn't possibly say that I was sleepy recently and needed everyone's monthly votes to wake me up, right? That was really too shameless. But I really needed everyone to cast their monthly votes. I needed your support. I liked the reward money and I liked the vanity that came with being ranked. I'll say it very seriously and honestly. If you think that I've written well, please cast your monthly votes to me. Thank you very much. Monthly votes were lethal weapons. Only the strong could wield them. I held my long sword and looked around blankly. There was a bamboo hat at my feet. I softly said, Give me some, give me some. Chapter 645. The original words were, "Soldiers are lethal weapons. Saints have no choice but to use them." I won't use such a merciful meaning, so I changed it to, "Those who are not saints cannot use them." I am satisfied that even if it is a story, it has to be carefully managed. Yesterday everyone gave me a lot of face and threw a lot of votes. I'm getting closer and closer to Lao Wu on the monthly votes list. I'm still 100 votes away from him. I feel like I can see stars shining. Let's keep chasing. Yahoo! This was a world of natural selection. To poke their heads out from the layers of reeds by the North Sea and to have the right to be first among the pack of wolves on the grasslands, they needed to abandon their so-called weak emotions. Saints were heartless and the most heartless. Otherwise it was not possible to transcend. The courtyard of the city lord's residence was quiet. The corpses and pools of blood on the ground had been pushed to the bottom of the courtyard walls by the previous tremors. It was as if they had been swept by the hand of God. The blood had turned into red paint that had been brushed with a few green leaves that had recently fallen. With these green leaves as a boundary, Sigujien and the Shadow, the two brothers, each sat below 2 stone steps. Heavily injured and speechless, they looked at each other coldly. Suddenly, a concentrated whistling sound came from outside the manor. It was like a dozen catapults had launched an attack on the manor at the same time. The millstone-sized rocks sliced through the air. Sigujian's expression did not change. The Shadow's expression did not change. Fan Xian was walking toward the Shadow. His expression also did not change. The three of them had all heard clearly that it was not rocks flying through the air. It was people. It looked like the bloody case in the manor had finally startled the aces standing stupidly outside the sword hut. The Northern Qi Emperor had come to Dongyi with Lang Tiao and Friar He, 2 9th-level aces. As for whether or not the Tianyi Dao sect had any hidden aces hiding in the dark to protect them, no one knew. Since the day before, all of the disciples of the sword hut had returned from their respective cultivation places and stood guard in front of the sword hut, silently waiting for their teacher's edict. Adding the two sides together, there were a dozen 9th-level aces. Thinking about it, there were only 2 9th-level aces in the entire Qing kingdom. One couldn't help but feel a glimmer of surprise and envy at Dongyi's uniqueness. With so many aces breaking through the air and arriving, the aura was indeed shocking. The wind blew. Yun Jilan and Lang Qiao led everyone and swept onto the blood-covered ground. The two of them furrowed their brows and unconsciously looked at their feet. They then saw the scene in the manor clearly. At the same time they found the person they cared about the most. Lang Qiao saw the emperor and found that the emperor seemed to be fine, only his face was slightly pale. He couldn't help but be overjoyed. Leading his subordinates, he surrounded the little emperor to ensure his safety. At the same time he turned a wary gaze toward Fan Xian. On the other side, Yun Jilan saw the heavily injured Sigujian sitting at the bottom of the stone steps. His expression changed dramatically in shock. He quickly rushed over. Without a word, his knees hit the ground with a bang and he knelt down. This first disciple of the sword hut was unable to hide the strange expression on his face. He didn't care how his teacher would punish him afterward. Since he dared to go against his teacher's intentions and secretly make a deal with the Northern Qi people, his sword heart had long been prepared. Looking at the wretched scene in the manor of the master of the city, the dead master of the city, and the aces in the manor, he knew who had done this. Since his teacher had personally taken action, it showed his attitude. What shocked Yun Jilan was that his teacher had been injured so heavily. All of the disciples of the sword hut knelt by Sigujian's side. They looked at their teacher's injuries with shock and anger. In these people's hearts, the only people in this world who could compare to their teacher were the great grandmasters. Even though their teacher had been injured for 3 years, the only people who could harm him were the Qing Emperor and the missing Yi Luyun. A disciple of the sword hut began to help bandage Sigujian's injuries with trembling hands. In his heart, his teacher was a godlike figure, particularly when it came to the sword. He was the foremost figure in the world. Now he had been stabbed twice in the chest. Who had done this? The door to the back of the manor moved slightly. The second disciple of the sword hut walked in, supporting 13th Wang. They saw the scene in front of them and couldn't help but be shocked. 13th Wang in particular was still poisoned. Last night, he had forcefully raised his realm and held a willow tree to stop everyone and help Fan Xian enter the sword hut. He was completely exhausted. If it weren't for his second disciple supporting him, he probably wouldn't have made it to the manor in time. Last night, the atmosphere inside the sword hut was harmonious. Outside the sword hut, swords were drawn. Everyone knew that the 13th disciple of the Sword Hut was Fan Xian's good friend. Fan Xian had taken the Northern Qi Emperor hostage and charged into the sacred and inviolable Sword Hut. Thus, everyone's enmity was directed at 13th Wang. If it weren't for the second disciple of the Sword Hut coldly protecting him, Yun Jilan would not have allowed Lang Qiao and the others to attack for the sake of his teacher's dignity. 13th Wang would probably be lying in bed. Of course, the reason 13th Wang was able to maintain his safety under the encirclement of so many aces was because of that leaf and that branch. The Sword Saint in the Sword Hut had already expressed his attitude. The disciples of the Sword Hut who had already leaned toward Yun Jilan's side could only maintain their neutrality. 13th Wang knelt by Sigu Jian's side. His lips trembled slightly. He couldn't say anything. After he entered the manor, he hadn't glanced at Fan Xian because his emotions were complicated. All of this had been ordered by his teacher. He had helped Fan Xian enter the Sword Hut. He had thought that his teacher and Sir Fan Jr. would have a harmonious conversation. He had not thought that his teacher would be so injured. The disciples of the Sword Hut all knew of the power of the manor of the master of the city and the terrifying power of the sword in their teacher's hand. Naturally, they thought that the person who had injured their teacher was not someone from the manor of the city but someone from the Qing kingdom. It was someone from Fan Xian. Yun Jilan was the first to stand. He looked coldly at Fan Xian and the black-clothed man by the stone steps. Gradually his eyes became icy. His gaze passed over Fan Xian and looked at the black-clothed man. His gaze changed from icy to burning. He knew the black-clothed man. It could even be said that he was very familiar with him. 4 years ago, by the Hangzhou Lake in the Qing Kingdom's Jiangnan, this black-clothed man had risen from the lake and stabbed him with a sword on the side of a small boat. Then, the two of them had carried out a chase and being chased for a number of months in the Jiangnan area. Yun Jilan knew the black-clothed man's strength. He had even always thought that, other than his teacher, this black-clothed man's sword technique was the sharpest and most sinister, even sharper than his own. Yun Jilan was already a 9th-level ace, so he knew how powerful the black-clothed man was. He didn't need to think too much to know that the only person present who could injure his teacher with a sword was that black-clothed man. He slowly pulled out the long sword at his waist and walked step by step toward the stone steps. The distance between each step was fixed, no more, no less, exactly 2 feet. The sword in his hand was 3 feet. The distance between him and the shadow was 30 feet. The legendary true master of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, Sir Shadow. As Yun Jilan walked, he coldly said, "This is the first time I've seen your true face." Yun Jilan took 5 steps closer and closer to the stone steps. The sword intent on his body grew thicker and his murderous intent grew stronger. Regardless of what difference this first disciple of the Sword Hut thought of the future of Dongyi and his teacher, when foreign enemies attacked and the Qing people dared to injure his teacher, Yun Jilan's chest was filled with murderous intent. He had to kill the other party under his sword. If the other party had been in perfect condition, Yun Jilan would not have had much confidence. However, he knew that even if the black-clothed man had taken advantage of the situation when his master was not paying attention to kill him and stabbed his master twice, the other party must have paid a great price for this. The disciples of the Sword Hut were deeply influenced by Sigu Jian's intentions. They did not care about using strength to bully the weak. Under the large tree, the Northern Qi Emperor watched this scene with a pale face. She didn't know if the Sword Hut and the Qing Kingdom would come to blows or how Fan Xian would deal with these matters. In her opinion, even if Sigu Jian wanted to reach an agreement with the Qing Kingdom, given this great grandmaster's bloodthirsty nature, he would not allow the black-clothed man, whom Yun Jilan called the head of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, to leave alive. Suddenly, the little emperor seemed to think of something. She thought of the words Sigu Jian had mentioned earlier. Her eyes lit up. A glimmer of red appeared on her pale face. Fan Xian was half kneeling by the shadow's side, helping him tend to the wounds on his body. The countless bloody cuts made by the sword qi were still seeping blood. Fortunately, the Overwatch Council's robes had some effect. The wounds were not deep and did not need any special treatment. Given the shadow's powerful body, he should be able to stop the bleeding. The biggest problem was inside the shadow's body. Fan Xian's palm was placed on his back. Slowly, he sent in a stream of Tianyi Dao's natural jinqi. Carefully, he checked the situation inside. His expression grew more and more serious. A moment later, he took out a medicine from his clothes and fed it to the shadow's lips. Then he pressed his palms tightly together and began to help him heal. The night before, he had treated 13th Wang's wounds. Yesterday, he had fought a desperate battle with Lang Qiao and the others. Last night, he had fought in bed with the little emperor. Fan Xian was exhausted. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, the shadow would probably die from internal bleeding. After the hanging temple incident, the shadow had followed Fan Xian for 4 years and never left his side. Although their relationship was that of a superior and subordinate and did not have much to do with the term friend, Fan Xian knew that he could no longer leave this person. This was a feeling of familiarity that came naturally after entrusting one's life to another for a long time. Fan Xian lowered his eyes, but he could still hear Yun Jilan's steady footsteps coming closer and closer. A moment later he slowly put down his hands and stood. Looking at Yun Jilan, he said, "Do you still want to kill me?" Yun Jilan was silent for a moment. He then said, "Your life and death will be decided by my teacher. However, this person must die." Fan Xian didn't think about anything. He slowly took off the long robe he was wearing, revealing a pure black suit underneath. He then bent down and pulled out his black dagger from his boot. He stood in front of the shadow. Fan Xian stood out. The atmosphere in the entire courtyard changed. From beginning to end he had not truly attacked. The only thing he had expended was his spirit, which had been forcefully worn away by Sigu Jian's powerful will. However, standing in front of the shadow, Fan Xian's spirit seemed to return to his body in an instant. He was cold and silent, unusually powerful. It was just like when he faced Yan Xiaoyi in the past. Everyone knew of Fan Xian's power. The current Qing official was no longer the young and inexperienced figure who had just entered the 9th level when he went to northern Qi as a diplomatic envoy. He was a true 9th level ace. He had silently killed Yan Xiaoyi, killed the old Qin master in Jingdo, forced back Haitang on the grasslands, and miraculously escaped twice from the combined attacks of a few 9th level aces. In his past encounters with 9th level aces, Fan Xian had, without exception, obtained complete victories. This was not a person's name or the shadow of a tree. It was a true accumulation of confidence. Even when facing the first disciple of the Sword Hut, Yun Jilan, Fan Xian still did not feel a glimmer of fear in his heart. He only looked at him coldly. His meaning was clear. "If you want to kill my subordinate, you have to let me kill you first." Fan Xian and Yun Jilan stood face to face. Behind Yun Jilan, more people stood up. There were 13 disciples of the Sword Hut, and all of them were present. Only 6 people stood up. However, it was the sharp sword intent emanating from these 6 people that merged with Yun Jilan's blade and suddenly shot out, causing Fan Xian's face to pale slightly. There were also a few disciples of the Sword Hut kneeling by Sigu Jian's side. Their hands and feet were busy, serving him fearfully. Among them were the 3rd and 4th disciples of the Sword Hut who had ambushed Fan Xian in the Plum Garden. The reason these 2 aces of the Sword Hut did not stand up was complicated. They knew that Fan Xian and the black-clothed man both knew the Sigu sword. They had not told Yun Jilan of this matter because the implications were too great. They were prepared to secretly report it to their teacher. Unexpectedly, too many things had happened these 2 days. They had not found an opportunity. They were shocked in their hearts and endlessly guessed the relationship between the black-clothed man at the bottom of the stone steps and their teacher. Why was he able to injure their teacher? 13th Wang also did not stand up. He did not look at Fan Xian. His heart was a mess. He didn't understand what had happened. He only faintly guessed a secret, but he could not speak of it. Yun Jilan did not know any of this. The cold-blooded assassination between him and the Shadow in Jiangnan was often only a matter of an instant. At that time, the Shadow had held back and had not demonstrated his ultimate skill. He only looked at Fan Xian and tightened his grip on the sword in his hand. Under the large tree, Sir Lang Tiao, who had his head down the entire time, suddenly tightened his pinky. The metal chain around his wrist suddenly tightened. Just at this moment, a slightly cold hand was placed on Lang Tiao's wrist, stopping him from attacking. Lang Tiao furrowed his brows slightly and looked at the emperor who had stopped him. He didn't understand why. He thought that this was a rare opportunity for the Qi kingdom. The Qin kingdom and Sigu Jian were about to reach an agreement. Now it was the Qin kingdom who had injured Sigu Jian. If he helped Yun Jilan capture or kill Fan Xian and then killed the black-clothed man who had injured Sigu Jian, the relationship between Dongyi and the Qin kingdom would completely break. As a warrior, Lang Tiao was indeed curious as to who that black-clothed man was. Was he truly the legendary foremost assassin in the world, the Shadow of the Overwatch Council? Was this assassin truly so powerful that he could injure Sigu Jian? The little emperor smiled slightly and looked at the tense scene by the stone steps. In a quiet voice she said, "Believe me, they won't be able to fight. Since it is so, why should we be the bad guys?" The atmosphere made it so that the people involved did not have the little emperor's judgment. Faced with the overlapping sword intents of 7 ninth level aces, even Fan Xian began to find it difficult to breathe. The cold sweat that had just dried not long ago began to trickle down his back again. He couldn't help but shiver. The sword hut was indeed a strange place. There were so many 9th level aces. If the Qing kingdom could not reach an agreement with Dongyi and actually send troops to attack, the leading generals would probably always have to face attacks in the dark. The sword intents spread out for a moment. Fan Xian knew that if they actually fought, it would be difficult for him to leave alive. Suddenly, the corners of his lips twitched. Smiling, he raised his head and swept his gaze across Yun Jilan's iron-like shoulders. Looking at Sigu Jian below the stone steps, he said, "Do you really want outsiders to interfere in your own affairs?" When these words fell into different people's ears, they had completely different meanings. Yun Jilan thought Fan Xian was talking about the northern Qi people. Coldly he said, "The disciples of the sword hut are enough. We don't need the help of our friends in the north." Under the tree, Lang Tiao smiled slightly and said, "If Sir Fan Jr. survives, I will personally challenge you." Fan Xian paid no attention to the words of these two aces. He only stared fixedly at Sigu Jian below the stone steps. Only Sigu Jian understood the true meaning of his words. This was a battle between two brothers. Did they really need outsiders to interfere? Earlier, when the shadow had used the thunderous strike, Fan Xian had been behind the wheelchair. However, he had only taken the little emperor away and had not attacked together with the shadow. Fan Xian had not interfered. Could a disciple of the sword hut interfere in the grievances between you two brothers? Fan Xian was gambling on Sigu Jian's pride and wildness. He was gambling that Sigu Jian had left the shadow alive earlier and would certainly have follow-up plans. Since this was so, how could Sigu Jian watch as his disciples ruined his grand plan for the sake of revenge? Sigu Jian raised his eyelids slightly and smiled. He sighed with some regret. It was as if he was regretful that Fan Xian had guessed his thoughts and was unable to see Fan Xian's true abilities. This great grandmaster glanced with disgust at the disciples kneeling beside him and scolded in a raspy voice, "I'm not dead. Why are you in such a hurry to mourn?" Strangely enough, as he scolded like this, the disciples beside him became happy and quickly stood up. Immediately after, Sigu Jian raised his left arm and glanced at 13th Wang. 13th Wang was familiar with this action. When he had descended Dong Mountain, he had carried it like this. After returning to Dongyi, he had still carried it like this. Thus he naturally crouched down. Sigu Jian leaned against his young disciple's wide and sturdy back and twisted his head comfortably. Return to the sword hut. 13th Wang made a muffled sound of agreement. He then stood up with his skinny teacher on his back and walked out of the sword hut. However, his body was already in terrible condition. A few of his brothers beside him quickly supported him and left with him. Just like this, Sigu Jian left without saying anything. He only left behind a ground of astonishment and eyes. Fan Xian looked at Yun Jilan, who was close at hand, and said, "Master Yun, you've already disobeyed the sword saint a few times. Do you want to do it again?" Yun Jilan was silent for a long time. He glanced at the shadow at the bottom of the stone steps and said, "Actually, I also want to carry teacher. However, I have too many things to carry." "There are some things that you don't need to carry." Fan Xian's expression did not change. He smiled slightly and said, "Because you can't carry it. Not only will it crush you, but it will also shatter the things you want to carry. Wouldn't that be a great sorrow?" Yun Jilan thought deeply for a long time. He then looked seriously at the blood and bodies in the manor, particularly the body of the master of the city to the side of the stone steps. A moment later, his expression calmed. He knew that his thoughts had, in the end, all come to nothing. He didn't know what kind of magic Sir Fan Jr. had used to not only have his teacher act and kill the entire manor of the master of the city, but even after he was injured, he didn't have any desire to kill the Qing people. In the end, it was this first disciple of the sword hut who did not understand Sigu Jian. No one in this world could persuade or tempt Sigu Jian to do anything. This great grandmaster did whatever he wanted to do. All of this was just his own thoughts. The sword hut withdrew from the manor. Only the northern Qi people, Fan Xian and the shadow were left. Lang Qiao placed his hands behind his back and walked out from under the tree. Looking at Fan Xian, he smiled slightly and said, "Sir Fan Jr. is indeed skilled. With just one sentence you were able to force the sword hut to not attack. However, I am not a Dongyi person. Today's opportunity is rare. Do you want to spar?" One cannot be shameless to such an extent. Fan Xian had just escaped the danger of the sword intent. His entire body relaxed from exhaustion. Sitting on the stone steps beside the shadow, he didn't even raise his head. With a smile, he said, "This is a sentence your emperor gave me today. I'll give it back to you." Sir Fan Jr., I don't know who is more shameless in this world. The curved knife and golden chain behind Lang Qiao's back rattled slightly in the wind. Paired with his steady voice, it was even more beautiful. Your sister is a disciple of Tianyi Dao and has received orders from my teacher to control the affairs of Qing Mountain. Although sister disciple Fan has returned to the Qing kingdom, the teachings of the sect still exist. Even if you don't remember old friendships, you still have to remember the righteousness of the sect. Last year, in late autumn, the Qing Mountain disciples suffered heavy casualties in Shiliang Road. Do you think I would let this go? So, you also know she died in Shiliang Road. Fan Xian raised his head. 2 beams of cold light shot out. Don't say there is anything wrong with Imperial Advisor Ku He's orders. Even if my sister takes over Haitang's control of Tianyi Dao in the future, if Tianyi Dao still dares to mess around in the Qing kingdom, I will still continue to kill. After these words were said, there was a clamor under the tree. Lang Qiao's brows also furrowed. He didn't know how Fan Xian could still be so unyielding under such urgent circumstances. Although the disciples of the Sword Hut had left, the Northern Qi aces were still there. Even if Sigu Jian was hindered by something and didn't want to kill Fan Xian or the black-clothed ace, when the Northern Qi people attacked, they would not have any psychological barriers. This first disciple of Tianyi Dao did not know what had happened last night. How could he know that Fan Xian looked at these Northern Qi aces as if they were his own subordinates? Your emperor is already one of my people. Are you still far from becoming one of my people? Under the tree, the little emperor smiled and said, Our Northern Qi is famous for its literature. Of course we will not bully the weak with numbers. So Lang Qiao, let's go. After these words were said, it was Fan Xian who furrowed his brows. He looked at the little emperor and suddenly said, Can you come over for a moment? It was extremely rude to speak to His Majesty the Emperor in such a tone. However, what shocked the Northern Qi people was that the emperor was not angry. He only smiled slightly and said, What business does Minister Fan have? Let's talk after you've rested. Fan Xian saw clearly the coldness and slight anger between the little emperor's brows. He knew that she was, after all, an emperor. In front of her officials, she was terrified of making a mistake. His words earlier had indeed crossed the line. He couldn't help smiling self-mockingly and said, Your Majesty, I have something important to report. The little emperor was silent for a long time. No one knew what kind of struggle she was going through in her heart. Today she had seen too many profound things that had nothing to do with power. Her state of mind had been greatly shaken. Looking at Fan Xian's expression, she thought of the even greater shock her state of mind had suffered last night. After a long time, the little emperor coldly said, All of you go out. I have something to say to Minister Fan. After these words were said, there was another clamor, particularly Lang Qiao, who turned his head in shock to look at his emperor. He didn't know what the situation was. A few days ago, the emperor had made up his mind to join hands with Yun Jilan's faction of the Sword Hut to kill Fan Xian in Dongyi. Yesterday, everyone had seen Fan Xian take the emperor into the Sword Hut. The hatred between the two sides should be irreconcilable. Looking at their expressions as they spoke, it was completely different from what everyone had imagined. Friar He, who had been standing by the little emperor's side the entire time, was also shocked. He glanced at Lang Qiao suspiciously and waited for him to speak. Lang Qiao took 2 deep breaths and waved his hand, leading everyone out of the manor. Regardless of whether or not he was worried that Fan Xian would harm the emperor, since the emperor had issued an edict as officials, they could only act according to the edict. The manor of the master of the city once again recovered its calm. Fan Xian stood and walked to the little emperor's side. Looking at her calmly, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, The things you heard at the end today don't tell anyone. Otherwise, I will also tell everyone what I know. The little emperor's expression changed slightly. A cold light flashed through her eyes. She had not thought that Fan Xian would guess her thoughts so quickly or that he would use her secret to threaten her. The head of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council was Sigu Jian's younger brother. This matter could be used to great effect. It could even shake the foundations of the Qing court and create an irreconcilable conflict between the Qing emperor and the Overwatch Council. Northern Qi's brocade guard was not just for show. A long time ago, the little emperor had learned from Wei Hua that the Qing emperor had always believed that the assassination in the Hanging Temple was done by Sigu Jian's unknown younger brother. The little emperor took a deep breath. This secret was too important for Northern Qi. To be able to throw the Qing kingdom into chaos, it could, without question, turn Northern Qi around. However, Fan Xian held a secret that was enough to topple all of Northern Qi. Her expression changed for a long time. In the end, she quietly said, "I understand." Outside the manor, the expressions of Lang Tiao and the others changed endlessly. They had never thought that after they had been so anxious all night outside the sword hut and constantly worried about the emperor's safety, in the end, the emperor and Fan Xian seemed to be having a very good conversation. Lang Tiao's pupils suddenly constricted. "Send an order back to the Qing kingdom to have Mu Ping rush back." To the side, Friar He's expression changed slightly. Lowering his voice, he said, "Do you suspect that Fan Xian has poisoned the emperor?" Fan Xian is a master of poisons. If he hadn't been poisoned, how could he have so easily let the emperor leave? Why did the emperor agree to stay and have a secret talk with him just now? Lang Tiao's eyes were filled with anger. Enunciating each word coldly, he said, "Fan Xian is as poisonous as a snake or scorpion. He cannot be underestimated." Lang Tiao's intelligent reaction could not be said to be slow. However, he had no idea that Mu Peng had long been locked up by Fan Xian in the 7th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. He also did not know that Fan Xian had indeed poisoned the little emperor. However, it was not a poison that would kill. Instead, it was a poison in the heart that had no antidote. Chapter 646. Sigu Jian did not give the order for the disciples of the Sword Hut to kill Fan Xian. He didn't even spare the leader of the Overwatch Council assassins who had dared to stab him. This reality made the disciples of the Sword Hut feel a glimmer of surprise and shock. Yun Jilan, who had silently walked out of the Sword Hut, felt even heavier. He looked around. His third brother and fourth brother were both left in the Sword Hut. It seemed that his teacher had something to tell them. Yun Jilan couldn't resist looking at the setting sun in the west and gently sighed. These two brothers respected him the most. They had also participated in keeping 13th Wang under house arrest and ambushing Fan Xian. Was the teacher keeping them here to ask about this matter? Given his understanding of Sigu Jian, if his teacher truly wanted to punish him for his actions, he probably wouldn't need to investigate or ask anything. He would directly have him kill himself. It would probably be difficult for him to summon the courage to resist. The faint light of dusk shone on the face of the first disciple of the Sword Hut. It was somewhat dim and helpless. Today the entire manor of the master of the city had died. It had sufficiently demonstrated Sigu Jian's attitude. In a few more days, the dragon flag of the Li family would probably be replaced by the dragon flag of the Dongyi Palace. He knew that perhaps this was an inevitability of history. Otherwise, his teacher would not have reached an agreement with Fan Xian and lowered his head to the Qing emperor. However, his heart still couldn't help but throb with pain. There was no longer any way to stop this matter from happening. One of the major powers in Dongyi, the manor of the master of the city, had all become corpses in pools of blood. Sigu Jian had used the simplest and crudest method to unify the thoughts of the entire upper class of Dongyi society and intimidate the thoughts of all the disciples in the Sword Hut. Presumably, the countless merchants and workers in the city were also willing to accept this reality. After all, fighting had never been an entertainment that merchants liked. Yun Jilan narrowed his eyes and looked at the mountain residence above. The Northern Qi Emperor had already silently returned to the mountain residence under the protection of Lang Tiao and Friar He. He didn't know what the Northern Qi people were thinking. Should he end the agreement he had secretly reached with them or continue moving forward? Following this, the mountain residence closed its doors and refused guests. This made Yun Jilan's complicated emotions even more complicated. The Northern Qi Emperor had risked thousands of li to come here. He must have had the attitude of paying a great price to finish this battle in one fell swoop. Why did the emperor seem to admit defeat after he was taken into the Sword Hut by Fan Xian and no longer try to tear apart the relationship between Dongyi and the Qing kingdom? Yun Jilan stood outside the mountain residence and quietly said a few words to Lang Tiao. With some sadness he walked down the mountain. As he walked, he thought to himself, just what kind of miraculous ability does Fan Xian have to be able to suppress Northern Qi until they can't move? He still didn't believe Fan Xian had this ability. He thought it must be because his teacher had clearly expressed his attitude to the Northern Qi Emperor that the Northern Qi people had become hopeless. Turning his head to glance at the Sword Hut in the dusk, Yun Jilan's expression was very serious. After a slight pause, he walked toward Dongyi. He would never betray the will of the Sword Hut and the interests of Dongyi. However, the people of Dongyi were anxious. Without the pressure of the officials of the master of the city, he, the first disciple of the Sword Hut, could only helplessly begin to manage state affairs. Contrary to what Yun Jilan had imagined, the Northern Qi people did not despair. More accurately, the Northern Qi emperor, whose surname was Zhan, did not despair. She sat coldly by the window and looked at the flowers burning like fire. Thinking of what had happened these 2 days, she couldn't help but feel her heart waver. When she was young, she had been held in the Empress Dowager's arms and sat on the throne. From that day on, she had no longer known fear or despair. A person in a certain position should have a corresponding ability to judge. The little emperor knew that in the matter of fighting for Dongyi, she had already lost to Fan Xian. She had lost completely. There was no chance of turning the situation around. On the other hand, she also knew that Sigu Jian had chosen the Qin kingdom not because this great grandmaster had any good feelings toward the Qin kingdom. Rather, it was because Fan Xian's existence seemed to be able to provide Dongyi with a sliver of protection in the future. The most important problem was still hidden in Sigu Jian's heart. After the clever Northern Qi emperor thought for a long time, she faintly grasped the crux. Although she still didn't know the details, she guessed that Sigu Jian would certainly cause Fan Xian a great deal of trouble in the future. Fan Xian's trouble was the Qin emperor's trouble and Northern Qi's blessing. Although she knew that if Fan Xian was truly ruthless enough, she could only become a puppet in his hands, Fan Xian had never been ruthless enough, particularly toward his own woman. The events of that night made the little emperor feel humiliated, stimulated, excited, and curious. Thinking about it in hindsight, it seemed to have been of great benefit. Fan Xian used this to control the little emperor. The little emperor also used the relationship between the two of them to put Fan Xian in a difficult position. The little emperor slowly turned her head and looked coldly at Sea Lily sitting by the bed. She said, "Beloved, comb my hair." Including Fan Ruoruo, there were 3.5 women on Northern Qi's side. As the little emperor calmly enjoyed Sea Lily's hand combing her hair, she silently thought about what Fan Xian should do with 3.5 women facing a father with potential cracks. Fan Xian was in the depths of the sword hut. Standing outside the door, he looked calmly at Sigu Jian on the bed. After the shadow woke up, he had found a place to heal. As a top assassin, he always had a final lair to lick his wounds. Fan Xian was not worried about this. In the dusk, he once again faced the sword-like gazes of the people of the sword hut and walked into the depths of the sword hut to deal with what the Northern Qi emperor had thought of earlier. Sigu Jian could bring him great trouble in the future. 13th Wang coughed and glanced at him. Carrying the basin of hot water, he walked past him and didn't say anything. Fan Xian turned his head and looked at the bloodstains on his back. He couldn't resist smiling. The scene earlier when he had turned his back on his teacher confirmed Sigu Jian's love for this young disciple. Including the basin of hot water inside the sect and the towel wiping his body, even a great grandmaster was sometimes like a pitiful old man being served by a filial son. The more Sigu Jian favored 13th Wang, the calmer Fan Xian's heart became. He coughed and cleared the thoughts in his mind. Stepping over the threshold, he sat on the chair by the bed. Looking at Sigu Jian, who had his eyes tightly closed, he said, "The shadow will not take over the sword hut." The rooms in the depths of the sword hut were completely silent. Other than 13th Wang in the courtyard, no one else could stay there. Even the sword children who served Sigu Jian personally had long been chased to the front of the hut. These abrupt words rang out in the quiet room, rising in spirals and not stopping for a long time. They came without reason and were spoken without rhyme or reason. The shadow was someone who wanted to kill Sigu Jian and was an official of the Qin Kingdom's Overwatch Council. Yet, Fan Xian had seriously said to Sigu Jian that the shadow would not take over the sword hut. Would Sigu Jian allow the shadow to inherit his most precious legacy in this world? Shockingly, Sigu Jian did not laugh at Fan Xian's speculation. Slowly opening his eyes, he carried a heart-shaking coldness. In a raspy voice he said, "Why can't he?" Fan Xian's heart tightened slightly. He hadn't thought that with one sentence, this great grandmaster would directly reveal his true thoughts. He couldn't help but smile bitterly. In a quiet voice he said, "Because he is my person." You are half a Dongyi person, but he is an entire Dongyi person. Sigu Jian slowly closed his eyes again. He is my younger brother. He is the true first disciple of the sword hut. After I die, if he doesn't take over the sword hut, does he have to hand it to you? Me? Fan Xian shrugged. I have my own teacher. Furthermore, I don't have the hobby of starting a sect. Sigu Jian closed his eyes and said, "How did you guess my thoughts?" Yun Jilan was originally a good choice. Unfortunately, he went against your wishes this time. Furthermore, he is used to official work. In terms of swordsmanship, it is difficult for him to advance. You won't just watch as the sword hut declines after your death. 13th Wang is a good choice. Unfortunately, you dote on him too much and have too high hopes for him. You would not want him to be bound by these grass huts. Only the shadow. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. You didn't kill him not because you couldn't bear to kill him. Saints are heartless. This is something you admitted earlier. You left the shadow with his life. Naturally, you have to use this life. If you leave the position of master of the sword hut to him, it will cause trouble in the future. You and I both know this. So, the matter at the hanging temple was really done by Qin Pingping. Sigu Jian suddenly cackled with great joy. Looks like even I have misjudged this old dog. He has no loyalty to your emperor to speak of. Fan Xian was not angry. He smiled warmly and said, no one can doubt the director's loyalty to the Qin kingdom. If you want the shadow to rise to the surface and incite a battle between the emperor and the director, I advise you to quickly give up. Sigu Jian fell silent. He didn't speak for a long time. The entire sword hut was enveloped in an oppressive atmosphere. From last night until now, Sigu Jian finally understood that Fan Xian, the son of an old friend, indeed had a calmness and even coldness that was difficult to find for normal people. He had guessed the true intentions he had been hiding from his slight movements. How long can you hide the fact that the shadow is my younger brother? A year? 2 years? Sigu Jian suddenly said coldly. What happened in Dongyi today will eventually be sent back to Jingdo. Do you really think your emperor won't guess anything? I don't care what he guesses. As long as he can drag it out, that's that. I hope you don't make this matter clear and real. Fan Xian looked at Sigu Jian's thin face without shrinking back. In Dongyi, there are only 6 people who can guess the shadow's identity. Earlier, the 3rd and 4th disciples in the hut had already seen you and told you what happened the night before. Presumably you had them seal their mouths. Given your position in their hearts, they probably won't say anything for the rest of their lives. As for 13th Wang, I believe in his nature and virtue. All that is left is me, you, and the little emperor. If you don't say anything and I don't say anything, what is there to be afraid of? Sigu Jian coldly said, the problem is that you still have no way of convincing me. Why wouldn't I say anything? Once the world knows of this matter, your emperor will certainly kill Qin Pingping. If Qin Pingping dies, what will you do? Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then said, you pretended to agree to the agreement between us. In reality, you put your sights on the future. If the director died, the Qin kingdom would sink into internal strife. How would we have the time to look elsewhere? I just don't trust your emperor. Sigu Jian suddenly opened his eyes and looked at him. I still trust you a little more. The problem is, as long as you are not emperor, it is useless no matter how much I trust your sincerity. It is not up to you to make decisions in the Qin kingdom. Fan Xian's expression was very serious. I indeed do not have the ability to make the decision to have the emperor give up on his determination to start a war. If you anger me, at least I can make the decision to have the Qin kingdom destroy your Dongyi. He stood up and said, don't try to incite internal strife in the Qin kingdom. Don't try to have my most respected elder sink into danger. Otherwise, there will be no agreement in my heart. Sigu Jian didn't say a word for a long time. Suddenly he said, if such a day truly came, would you still have the heart to think about Dongyi? These are all things that haven't happened, but this kind of threat is an alarm that can be sounded ahead of time. Sigu Jian looked at him and said, did you also use such a crude method to force the female emperor of Northern Qi to shut her mouth? Fan Xian was not worried that the little emperor's gender would be leaked by Sigu Jian. The collapse of Northern Qi was not a scene this great grandmaster wanted to see. Straightforwardly he replied, I have found that I can only use a crude method to solve these problems. This is what I learned from you. Don't try to use me or control me, Fan Xian said. His state of mind was in a mess. It was as if he had returned to the old Fan Manor in Jingdo many years ago and he was talking to his father. From the moment he came to this world, each of his actions and thoughts appeared to be free. In reality, they had always been shrouded in countless shadows. His father, the emperor, Qin Pingping, and all of the old men were arranging his future according to what they thought was correct. Later there were a few more monsters among these old men such as Ku He and Sigu Jian on the bed. They all wanted to use what had happened in the past to secretly control him. If Fan Xian was not Fan Xian, his life would probably be much easier. As long as he continued to walk at a fixed pace, he would be able to live happily. However, he did not want this. Even if Yi Qingmei's name always shrouded his head, he still did not want it. After 2 days, the 2 major diplomatic groups from Qing and Northern Qi finally slowly and solemnly arrived on the road. After the two diplomatic groups left the Song Kingdom, they began a vigorous race at low speed on the road. It seemed that neither wanted to be the first to step onto Dongi's territory and launch the first wave of political attacks. The head envoy of the Northern Qi diplomatic group, Wei Hua, faintly felt that it was strange, but he could not change anything. He guessed helplessly that Fan Xian had probably long arrived in Dongi. However, the officials of the Board of Rights in the Qing diplomatic group had no idea that the Northern Qi negotiator who had arrived early in Dongi was their emperor. The welcoming ceremony in Dongi was very lively. However, it was hard to avoid a number of problems in the middle. Because all of the officials in the manor of the master of the city had died, the officials Yun Jilan had recruited from various territories acted hastily. These details all fell into the eyes of the officials of the two diplomatic groups. Immediately after, they learned of the murder that had happened in the manor of the master of the city. They involuntarily looked at each other, unsure of what had happened. In reality, the true negotiations had ended long before the diplomatic groups entered the city. The true major figures of both sides had already exchanged blows countless times in secret. They had already set down a solid foundation for the ownership of Dongi. On this day the spring sunshine was bright and beautiful. On this day in the courtyard where the Qing diplomatic group lived, the officials of the Qing kingdom were dumbfounded. They looked at Sir Fan Jr., who sat at the head of the table. They were so shocked that they could not speak for a long time. Of course, they knew that Sir Fan Jr. had entered Dongi ahead of time. But they could not have imagined that Sir Fan Jr. had used only 3 days to beat back the aggressive offensive of the Northern Qi people, convince the proud and aloof Sword Saint Grandmaster, suppress the opposing forces in Dongi, and help the Qing kingdom settle this matter. After hearing Sir Fan Jr.'s words, all of the Qing officials became excited. If it weren't for the Dongi officials outside, the cheers would probably have broken through the roof and rushed into the blue sky above Dongi's head. The Qing kingdom was born from blood and fire. From a small country on the edge, it had developed into the most powerful country in the world. It had relied on endless conquering of the borders and endless wars. Particularly 20 or 30 years ago, the emperor had personally led an army to conquer the north and the south. Only then was he able to conquer the Qing kingdom's present territory and power. The words "conquering the borders" had long become a part of the blood of the Qing people. Regardless of whether it was corrupt officials or honest officials, peddlers and pawns or scholars, they all passionately hoped that the Qing kingdom could unify the world. However, 20 years ago the 3 major powers in the world had stood together. The Qing kingdom had been quiet for too long. The enthusiasm for conquering the borders had been suppressed for too long. After the Dong Mountain incident, knowing that the 2 great grandmasters of the enemy countries were no longer an obstacle, all of this enthusiasm exploded forth. Dongi was added to the Qing kingdom's territory. This was not conquering Nanzhao or invading the grasslands to the west. It was also not fighting back and forth with Northern Qi to carve out a bit of land. It was truly conquering a large power. Other than the emperor's 3 personal expeditions to the north, which had shattered the Wei kingdom and established the Qing kingdom, being able to conquer Dongi was, without question, the most glorious stroke in the Qing kingdom's history of conquering the borders. All of the officials looked at Fan Xian like they were looking at a god. Their eyes were burning with passion. Without wasting a single soldier and just relying on negotiations, they were able to obtain such great benefits for the Qing kingdom. They could no longer find any words to describe their feelings. They even thought that the emperor truly had foresight and was prepared to make Sir Fan Jr. a king 2 years ago. Sir Fan Jr. had accomplished such a great deed. Even if he didn't split the land, he would not be able to escape being made a king. For a moment, the slightly old vice minister of the Board of Rights found it difficult to digest this shocking piece of good news. He was so excited that his face flushed red. A gurgling sound came out of his throat and blocked the phlegm in his mouth. He watched as Fan Xian collapsed. Fan Xian walked out of the unusually lively diplomatic mission, but there was not a trace of joy on his face. Logically speaking, to be able to convince Sigu Jian, subdue the Northern Qi emperor, and use this relatively peaceful method to bring Dongi into the territory of the Qing kingdom was certainly the greatest thing he could do in his life. But he still could not be happy. He knew what kind of danger was hidden behind Sigu Jian's agreement. He had already told the officials in the diplomatic mission that the person responsible for the details of the negotiations on Dongi's side was the first disciple of the Sword Hut, Yun Jilan. Yun Jilan's position in this matter had long been known to everyone. Sigu Jian had chosen him to come out to negotiate. Without question, he wanted to use an unyielding attitude to obtain the greatest benefit for Dongi. Fan Xian did not care about this. Whether it was actual rule or submission in name was not a problem he needed to consider this year. After Sigujian's death, Dongyi did not have much power to oppose. As for whether it would not change for 50 years or 5 years, that was the emperor's decision. Thinking of this, his mood became gloomy again. The secret report to Qin Garden had long been sent out. The shadow, who had sunk into silence the entire time, had also been sent to the Jiangnan Palace treasury to be treated. However, Fan Xian had no confidence in whether or not he would be able to calmly digest this matter. Walking out of the gates of the diplomatic mission and getting into the carriage, Fan Xian leaned against the window with a headache and looked at the prosperity in Dongyi. This prosperity did not appear artificial because of the arrival of the diplomatic mission from the two countries. It also did not appear desolate because of the collective deaths of the officials of the manor of the master of the city. The merchants' courageous nature and pursuit of profit made them appear unrestrained and incomparably free. The black carriage came to the end of Chang Street. There were 3 directions. The member of the Qinian unit driving the carriage asked, "Commissioner, where do we go now?" "To the seaside," Fan Xian replied quietly. The carriage took a long time to pass through Dongyi. It avoided the busy transport groups and headed in the direction of the busiest port. It came to the quietest silver beach outside of Dongyi. The official driving the carriage jumped down and led it to the side of a beach. Suddenly he realized that there was already someone on the beach. Furthermore, he acutely sensed the other party's identity. His pupils constricted abruptly. Lowering his voice, he said, "Northern Qi." Fan Xian had already stepped down from the carriage. Looking at the members of the Qinian unit beside him, he smiled and said, "I came today to find these Northern Qi people." This member of the Qinian unit was the one Fan Xian had met in Qingzhou last autumn. Fan Xian had no doubt about the loyalty of these trusted aides. Under Wang Qinian and Deng Ziyu's training, these trusted aides only knew Fan Xian. Perhaps they didn't even care about the one in the palace. He had a meeting with someone, so Fan Xian did not bring the 6th Bureau swordsman of the Overwatch Council. He only brought this trusted aide. The member of the Qinian unit was stunned. Very cleverly, he did not ask any more questions. He led the carriage to a quiet place and waited under a green tree branch. He closed his eyes and pretended to sleep. Stepping on the soft sand, Fan Xian walked step by step toward the seaside. There were a few people by the seaside looking at the sea. The waves of the East Sea were calm and gentle. They gently lapped against the silver sand, painting it with different shades of wet color. Paired with the circle of rocks not far in the sea and the layers of green trees behind the beach, it looked very beautiful. Fan Xian raised his hands and bowed seriously. "Greetings, Sir Langqiao." Langqiao looked at him calmly. His hands hung naturally by his side. His 2 curved knives hung by his side in chains, swaying gently in the sea breeze. He looked at the young man in front of him. His emotions were complicated, but his expression was unusually calm. A moment later he opened up the path to the seaside and walked toward the distance of the beach. Fan Xian walked to the side of the young man wearing a plain robe and full of scholarly aura. Putting his hands behind his back, he looked at the sea with him. Sea Lily wore a beautiful light yellow dress. Like a fairy, she smiled as she accompanied the 2 of them. The young man was the young emperor of Northern Qi. Northern Qi had completely lost the Dongyi matter. He could not leave the court in Shangjing and the throne for too long. He had to leave today. In the diplomatic group, the officials of the Qin kingdom had been excited and worried that Northern Qi would sabotage them. At the time, Fan Xian did not reply because he was about to meet the Northern Qi emperor. The Northern Qi emperor's sword-like eyebrows remained straight. His eyes were clear and determined. No one would be able to see that under his clothes he was a woman. He didn't even glance at Fan Xian. Suddenly he raised his right arm and pointed at the vast sea. In a particularly firm tone he said, "If I were a man, I would certainly be able to unite the world and conquer this sea." The waves suddenly grew and crashed into the rocks in the distance, stirring up a thunderous sound and swallowing up the Northern Qi emperor's words, which were full of confidence and dissatisfaction. Chapter 647. In the blink of an eye, the waves on the shoreline expressed their anger toward the rocks and longing for the sand. The sound of the waves was like thunder and they were shaped like snow. Without touching the clothes, they retreated, leaving behind a patch of peace. Half the eyes were blue sea and the other half were blue sky. Fan Xian heard her words clearly and couldn't help smiling bitterly. "If I were a woman, I would certainly be much happier than I am now." He knew that the little emperor had too much dissatisfaction and unwillingness in her heart. As a person of the Qing kingdom, Fan Xian didn't have many opportunities to experience the little emperor's imperial schemes and power plays. After so many years of private interactions, he knew that although the Northern Qi emperor was younger than him, her will was particularly mature. Her methods of doing things were unusually cold and heartless. Perhaps the dragon chair was indeed an incubator that could turn people into strange creatures? From birth, the female emperor beside him had been raised as a man. The process of her growth had been a completely abnormal process. Even now she had not become a pervert. Instead, she had become a slightly cold, ambitious, and particularly unwilling emperor to the arrangements of fate. It should be said that the Northern Qi Empress Dowager was truly an extraordinary figure. Thinking of how he had thought there was a big problem between the Empress Dowager and the Emperor and wanted to use this to wedge himself into Northern Qi court politics, in the end, he had helped this mother and son cover up, got rid of Shenzhong and subdued Shang Shanhu. Fan Xian felt a bit of bitterness in his heart. His admiration for this mother and son grew stronger and stronger. Woman? The Northern Qi Emperor placed her hands behind her and looked at the boundless ocean in front of her. A glimmer of mockery rose to the corners of her lips. In this world, women are all accessories to men and are forever in a position to be dominated. If you truly became a woman, you would probably cry endlessly in your blankets every night. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then suddenly said, "Do you loathe your identity as a woman?" "Correct," the Northern Qi Emperor said coldly. "If my body wasn't that of a woman, how could I be threatened by you?" Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. He thought to himself that this female emperor's heart was indeed a bit like a heartless man's. Everything she thought about was power and country. She lacked much of the gentleness he had imagined. The two of them fell into silence at the same time. They stood side by side and looked at the sea with their hands behind their backs. Not far from them, Sea Lily, dressed in light yellow, was holding a delicate little paper umbrella in one hand. She crouched down slightly and was picking up seashells on the beach. It was unclear whether or not her attention was on the two of them. The tips of Fan Xian's brows rose slightly. He thought of the seaside in Danzhou 3 years ago when he and the emperor had stood on a wooden plank and looked at the sea. At that time, white waves had risen from under their feet. Now he was once again looking at the sea side by side with the Northern Qi Emperor. Putting aside the change of time and the flow of time, just these 2 times looking at the sea was enough to explain many problems. After struggling and working hard for a long time in this second life, he finally had an influence that others could not have in Northern Qi in the Qing kingdom. The Northern Qi Emperor's expression was cold. His straight, sword-like brows appeared particularly calm. His clear eyes had a sense of keeping strangers away. His not-so-long eyelashes rested calmly on his eyelids. The diplomatic mission has already arrived in Dongyi. I must return. She suddenly looked forward and said, I must admit that I have taken the risk to come south this time and have not obtained any benefits. I'm very disappointed. What is there to be disappointed about? At least you didn't kill me. The world hasn't fallen into chaos. Fan Xian looked at her expression. For some reason he felt a faint sense of pity in his heart. It was just like that crazy night when he saw her cry crazily. He knew that this emperor, who was female and had a man's heart, had not lived a happy life. Quietly he said, although you are the monarch of Northern Qi, you cannot change what has already been decided. The Northern Qi Emperor's voice was slightly sharp. Using a harsh and bitter tone, she said, For example, I am a woman? Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He wondered how the conversation had turned to this again. Shaking his head, he said, It is very difficult for one person to change the entire world. This has nothing to do with gender. In a cold voice, the Northern Qi Emperor said, But, in my view, the most spectacular losers in the world these 30 years, the most stunning losers, all happened to be 2 women who refused to accept the arrangements of fate and stood out bravely. How do you explain that? How did he explain it? Fan Xian was completely unable to explain it. One of those 2 women was his mother and the other was his mother-in-law. As a child, he could reminisce, be sentimental and bear grudges, but he could not explain it. He opened his mouth and said, My mother's failure was because she was too kind. The eldest princess's failure was because she was too sentimental. The Northern Qi Emperor looked at him calmly and said with a smile, In reality, the reason is simpler than you say. It is just that you don't dare to say it. Putting aside the eldest princess, wasn't the reason that terrifying mistress of the Yi family had failed because of that man? Fan Xian would not continue this topic in front of her. Quietly he said, "Today when your majesty leaves, I hope you will tidy up the court and support the people. As for other matters, it is best not to act rashly. Before you become the emperor of the Qing kingdom, don't ever hope that I will count on you for anything," the Northern Qi emperor said. The Northern Qi emperor said, "This has nothing to do with trust. It only has to do with the power of one's words. That day Sigu Jian took us through Dongyi. You should know what it was for." Fan Xian sighed and said, "He took me to talk about the past, the future, to see Dongyi and to deepen our feelings. It was all for this. Dongyi is not the Qi kingdom or the Qing kingdom. The city is too special. If Sigu Jian wishes to preserve the uniqueness of Dongyi after his death." The little emperor turned her head and looked at him. "He can only hope that you can become the emperor of the Qing kingdom." Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly and said, "Do you think that is possible? This is precisely why I look down on you. You are in a dilemma, unable to advance or retreat. You have no idea what you need to do." The Northern Qi emperor turned her head and mockingly said, "If you are truly a saint like Master Zhuang and don't want the people of the world to sink into the flames of war, then you can't just sit around and do nothing. You are doing your best to mend things, but you are unable to change the fundamental nature of the situation. In the end you can only end up with a tragic end. You should know without me saying how wretched your end will be." On the contrary, Fan Xian smiled and said, "It looks like you finally believe I have the potential to be a saint." The Northern Qi emperor was silent for a long time. She then slowly said, "Other than being forced to believe you are a saint, I can't think of any other reason why you would do these things. If Fan Xian only saw himself as an official of the Qing kingdom and single-mindedly helped the Qing kingdom unify the world, now that Dongyi had been subdued and he grasped the greatest secret of the Northern Qi royal family, there were too many things he could use and too many powerful moves he could use. However, he didn't do anything. He was just like the little emperor described, running around tirelessly sewing and mending, forcefully suppressing all possible disasters into the darkness of the Overwatch Council. I don't want to be a saint, nor do I have the ability to be one." Fan Xian tiredly lowered his head. "I have just become much braver than before. I am willing to follow my own thoughts and change some things I don't want to see in this life." The Northern Qi emperor gazed at him and smiled. "Even if you have to pay with your life?" "No," Fan Xian said straightforwardly. "My own survival is the most important. My family's survival is the second most important. Innocent people's survival is the third most important. If that day truly comes, I think the only person in this world who has the power to kill me will not be able to kill me." "Why? Because he is your father? Or is it because he knows there is a temple behind you?" A strange light flashed through the little emperor's eyes as she slowly asked. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Your Majesty does not have a shred of respect or fear for the temple." Then he closed his mouth and didn't explain anything more. There was no need to let the Northern Qi people know of the emperor's fear of Uncle Wuzhu. "I have questions about your earlier words." The sea breeze blew against the Northern Qi emperor's determined face. It didn't move her non-existent bangs or make her feel any sense of weakness. "You think that your own survival is the most important. Then let me ask you, if the person being compared was Princess Qin, would you still think your own survival is the most important?" Fan Xian was silent. The tablecloth in the Qing temple, the paintings, the ancient legends, the white-clothed girl hiding under the table and eating a chicken leg, the snow on Song Mountain, the medicine at their first marriage, the crying in the carriage, and the usual silence rose in his heart. Suddenly, a powerful feeling of remorse surged in his heart. Raising his head, he said seriously, "Of course, her life is more important than mine." "Minister Fan?" "Yes." "Your children?" "I'm not sure." "The Fan family's aunt disciple?" "Yes." "Qin Pingping?" After a long silence, Fan Xian gently nodded. The Northern Qi emperor smiled and looked at him. "You truly are a strange person. You are so protective of an old cripple, yet you don't have the courage to risk your life for your own woman. They are still young." The expression in Fan Xian's eyes was somewhat empty. For things like feelings, other than bloodline, there is also the problem of time. The Northern Qi emperor was silent for a long time. "It looks like even if I had a child with you, I would not be able to completely control you." Fan Xian thought for a moment and then said, "Actually, we are very similar people, cold-blooded and heartless. It is just that you are a woman and I am a man." "Heartless? Your words earlier almost made me think you were a saint who cared for the people of the world. Didn't Sigu Jian say that saints are heartless?" "He didn't say that. I don't want to argue about this." The little emperor suddenly glanced at him and said, "You are my first man and my last man. Although I don't like that feeling, I don't mind having a child for you. I also don't mind." Fan Xian's smile was somewhat mysterious. "Of my 3 great wishes in this life, one is to have many, many children." He suddenly changed the topic and said, "As for the last man, don't say such nonsense. You are an emperor. As they say, after eating the marrow one will yearn for the taste. I dare to bet that once you grow up and firmly control the northern Qi court, there will certainly be a lot of medicinal dregs in Shangjing's harem." The northern Qi emperor did not understand this joke, but she understood the meaning. Her face paled slightly. Her anger flashed and was immediately hidden. Coldly she said, "Do you think I am a pervert like you?" Fan Xian shrugged and said, "Who knows? No one would dislike the pleasure between a man and a woman. As for the matter of having children, you didn't get pregnant that summer in the ancient temple. Perhaps you won't get pregnant this time either." "I don't like men." The little emperor stared at him. At this moment, Si Lily, who had been standing silently by the side, walked over and stood beside the two of them. Her brows were gentle and she didn't say a word. The little emperor wrapped her arms around Si Lily's waist and looked at Fan Xian. "I like women. These are my women. This kind of thing doesn't scare me. Your Majesty doesn't know that the 2 men I admired the most in the past, one was surnamed Zhang and the other was surnamed Kai. They both liked men." Fan Xian shrugged his shoulders and looked at the 2 women beside him. Their temperaments and appearances were completely different. Suddenly his heart jumped. He raised his hand and very quickly swept it across the 2 people's chins. Moistening his fingertips, he quietly said, "You are both my women. That is enough." The little emperor furrowed her brows as if she was not used to the frivolity by the seaside. Slightly angry she said, "Don't be presumptuous. What about me? Do you think I will believe you when you say you don't like men in front of me?" Fan Xian looked at her calmly. "You've been acting for 20 years. It's been hard on you. Don't act in front of me anymore." "I don't like men." The little emperor looked at him calmly. "I chose you because you were born beautiful, more beautiful than a woman." With these words, Fan Xian had lost. He had lost wretchedly. The northern Qi emperor smiled slightly and said, "Of course, other than being as beautiful as a flower, you also have other benefits. I once said why I chose you back then. Presumably, Duo also thanked you for writing a biography for her boudoir, but..." She furrowed her brows and said, "I still don't understand how you discovered my secret." Si Lily leaned against the northern Qi emperor's side and looked at Fan Xian with her large, expressive eyes. Presumably, she was also filled with curiosity about this matter. There was the fragrance of golden osmanthus in that old temple. Later, I learned from the great Wang Fei that this kind of golden osmanthus was only grown on the mountain behind Shangjing Palace. In the entire world, only the emperor would use this kind of fragrance. Fan Xian quietly told the story. The northern Qi emperor's brows furrowed even tighter. No matter what, she found it difficult to believe that it was this faint fragrance that had exposed her secret. "Of course, Your Majesty's passion for the story of the stone is a bit excessive." The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. "Bao Dai's story is one of the best tools for determining gender." "I still don't believe it," the northern Qi emperor said coldly. The northern Qi emperor coldly said, "What kind of secret is this? How could you think in that direction based on these 2 points? I admit that you are the most intelligent person in the world, but..." Before she finished speaking, Fan Xian already understood what she meant. Any investigation into a secret needed a primer. For something that no one had ever dared to think about, naturally no one would doubt it. The little emperor still did not understand how Fan Xian dared to think in that direction. He stood on the seashore and laughed happily. His laughter traveled along the waves and traveled very, very far. "Do you know who Zhu Tai is? Shakespeare's lover? Mu Wanqing? Prince's coffee shop? A pregnant female bishop? A young boy and girl?" Fan Xian looked at the 2 perplexed women beside him and said in a loud voice, "That is Harita Maki, my favorite." After a bout of laughter, Fan Xian stood by the seaside and immediately felt comfortable. His talent in martial arts was not as good as Haitang in 13. In terms of politics, he could not catch up to the emperor. He was not as good as his father-in-law at cultivating disciples. In terms of scheming, he was far behind Chen Pingping and even Yan Bingyun. He was not as patient as his father. He was not as determined as Ku He. He was not as clear as the little emperor about what she wanted. He was not as good as Sigu Jian, who could see all things as ants. There were too many exceptional people in this world. Fan Xian was not much. The only thing he could rely on was his own hard work. However, in this second life he was so successful and stood in his current position. It was because his mother had come to this world in advance and he was the same. He also had a lifetime's worth of knowledge that the people of this world did not have. This was the source of his courage and the foundation of his confidence. Lang Qiao stood on a large tree by the seaside. The tips of his feet stepped on the treetop. As the sea wind blew, he floated gently. The two curved knives by his side made a clanking sound. He narrowed his eyes and looked calmly at the seaside. He didn't hear clearly what the emperor and Fan Xian had said, but he heard clearly Fan Xian's wild and somewhat arrogant laughter at the end. The three people by the seaside knew that it was not just Lang Qiao. Perhaps there were other powerful figures such as people from the Sword Hut, who were secretly watching this conversation. However, they were not very worried. They faced the ocean. There was no one on the ocean. Fan Xian's hand held the Northern Qi Emperor's hand and then Sea Lily's. Calmly he said, "No matter which one of you is pregnant, don't forget to tell me the father." After these words were said, the Northern Qi Emperor's expression darkened. He glanced at Sea Lily. Fear floated onto Sea Lily's face, but she was not very afraid in her heart. If one were to look from behind, Sea Lily was leaning against the Northern Qi Emperor's side, while Fan Xian was standing on the other side. The three of them did not appear small against the backdrop of the blue sea. On the contrary, there was a sense of warmth. That night, a heavily guarded but unmarked group left Dongyi. Other than those in the upper echelons, no one knew that the Northern Qi Emperor and Imperial Consort Li were in this group. The Northern Qi Emperor had bravely come to Dongyi with the determination to cut off all means of retreat and try to find the last chance of victory for his country. In the end he returned gloomily. Other than receiving Fan Xian's nonchalant words, he had gained nothing. Of course, for a woman, even if this woman claimed to like women, to be able to have such a night and such a beautiful beach in this absurd and dangerous imperial life, perhaps this would be a story that she would never forget for the rest of her life. To have this was actually enough, was it not? When the Northern Qi Emperor looked back at Dongyi in the dusk from the window of the carriage, was she thinking of Northern Qi's future or that man? The Northern Qi diplomatic group remained in Dongyi, but they had all given up hope. Although Dongyi still treated them with courtesy, everyone could clearly see that they had already begun negotiations with the Qin people. The details of the negotiations had been released through some unknown channel. The Qin kingdom's conditions were not harsh. For the merchants and commoners of Dongyi, they were unexpectedly relaxed. Other than the vassal states that were about to send their hostages into Jingdo and sink into a gloomy fog, the reactions of the commoners were rather normal. Of course they would be sad and disappointed just like Yin Zhilan. However, there was no overly intense opposition. The negotiations were still ongoing. The implications of this matter were too great. Even if they had to talk for an entire year, it was completely necessary. Thus, the secret message sent from the Jingdo Palace was not overly hurried. On the contrary, the Qing Emperor told Fan Xian not to rush. His words were filled with comforting and encouraging words. Fan Xian was not in a rush. He had talked for a number of years about that beautiful city in the south, much less today's situation. He just wandered the streets in Dongyi and meditated by the seaside. Occasionally he would drink tea with 13th Wang and repair their relationship. His entire behavior was not like that of a powerful official of the Qin kingdom. Rather, he was like an idling Dongyi person with nothing to do. Time passed in a flash. Fan Xian had been in Dongyi for almost a month. He finally stepped into the Sword Hut again to see the great grandmaster who had been injured by the shadow and was bedridden. P.S. Today's chapter was very annoying to write about. Women are too difficult to write about. They also have to make everyone's appearance and personality different. Furthermore, it is easy to attend to one and lose sight of the other. It is too exhausting. I've decided that the next book will have at most 4. As for the different colors of the sea in yesterday's chapter, it refers to the human heart being like the sea. The depth is different, but it is all very complicated. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.